lesson is not what Mr. Putin has taught us. It is what the great Ukrainian people have taught us. Because Ukrainians are not only victims. Obviously, they are victims. This is self-evident. But they are something more important than victims. They are heroes. They are heroes because they resisted. They are heroes because they fought back against aggression, against the forces of evil. And they have taught us all in Europe a valuable lesson to get us out of the sometimes state of complacency that behind our democracy, behind our freedoms, behind our rights, institutions, rule of law, everything that the autocrats mistakenly understand as think of as weakness, lies a fighting spirit, the spirit of resistance, the spirit to defend our freedom. And in that, we are together with the Ukrainians, and we will help the Ukrainians, because their fight is our fight. But make no mistake, the problem is not only Russia. It's more general, more broad. And there are others who are trying to hide behind the turmoil in Ukraine to continue their violation of the rules and principles of our Council of Europe. So make no mistake, those autocrats, in Turkey and elsewhere. This is not time for aggression. This is not time for revision. And we stand united in Europe against the forces of evil everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitros. Next on our list is Mr. Geraint Davis from the United Kingdom. You have the floor, sir.
Mr. President, our mission in the Council of Europe is to defend and promote democracy, human rights and the rule of law. And what we've seen with this brutal, irresponsible, criminal and barbaric invasion of Ukraine is a smashing of those values and rights in Ukraine. And our duty now is to inspire the defence and promotion of those values in the Ukraine. Now, we all know that we haven't got resources here, either to provide humanitarian aid or indeed military aid. All we can do is inspire our members to take action, and that's what we should do. We all support sanctions, and sanctions indeed will reduce the size of the Russian economy by 8.5% in 2022, according to the IMF. But sanctions take time. Sanctions don't stop tanks. And the reality is that the reason that Ukraine hasn't fallen, been overwhelmed, is because of the bravery of the Ukrainian soldiers, the leadership of Zelensky, but also the military support, giving the Ukrainians the tools to do their job, to defend themselves and their families. Otherwise, we wouldn't have prevented defeat. We also know from 2014 that Russia has increased its food output by 15%, cereal output by 26%. It's basically become self-sufficient. We know that in Beijing in February in the Olympics, they agreed a massive deal with China for 10 billion cubic meters of gas per day from 2025. That compares with 1.25 billion a day at the moment. India, Indonesia are buying that gas. In other words, they're selling more gas and oil. They're producing their own food. They're getting consumer goods and technology from China so they can play the long game. We know what they do. We saw them invading Georgia. We saw them invading Crimea. They're taking over control of Belarus, Ukraine. Finland will be next. So it is imperative that we do everything in this report, but also give the support to the Ukrainian people to do what needs to be done. We've heard a lot of threats, obviously, from Putin. He said, oh, you have sanctions, you stop SWIFT, or you introduce sanctions on me personally. These will be irreversible acts of war, but nothing else happened. The truth is, nobody is proposing an existential threat to Russia. No one's suggesting we should attack Russia. What we're saying is we should free Ukraine to resume its legitimate status as a democracy with human rights. That is our duty. That's what we should encourage, so that 5 million people who've left can return. We can invest in reconstruction. We can provide sanctuary in the meantime. We can deliver justice. But ultimately, we've got to do what needs to be done to get rid of Mr. Putin and his barbaric army out of Ukraine and defend and promote democracy and rule of law. That is our duty. Let's get on with it.
Thank you very much, Geraint. Next on the speakers list is Mr. Jacek Protasevich from Poland. I hope I pronounced your first name correctly. You have the floor, Mr. Protasevich. He should be here online, but he is not online with us.
Online, but we don't hear. We don't hear.
Mr. Protasevich, we cannot hear you. Please, could you again ask for the floor so that we can...
It's okay. He didn't have his micro.
Can you put your microphone on? Try again. We will come back to Mr. Protasevich in a moment. We now first go to Madam Olena Komenko from Ukraine. Olena, you have the floor.
Dear President, Madam Secretary General, sirs and madams, with reference to the text itself and following yesterday's debate on the draft of the resolution, I feel obliged to point the following. The Ukrainian society understands perfectly well the limits of the nature of documents like resolutions which are being adopted at the Council of Europe. Upon its adoption, there will be a lot of comments in the Ukrainian audience that this leads to nothing in terms of bringing the abuser to regret its action and stop them. It is particularly true given the exclusion of Russia from the Council of Europe, which happened on the last session of Council of Europe. Yet, even recognizing these limits, the Ukrainian society closely follows the wording of the text of Council of Europe resolution on Russian aggression in Ukraine. It does pay attention to this because the text reflects the political atmosphere and attitudes of different Council of Europe member states towards the Russian barbaric warfare. What we shall find in this new resolution? Similar vague words of general nature like confirms in the strongest terms its condemnation or unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, or a strong call for unity in supporting Ukraine, or exerting maximum pressure on the Russian Federation to cease its aggression. Is that strong call for unity enough? What is that maximum pressure which may force Russia to admit all its wrongdoings and retreat from Ukraine? That again remains very vague and unclear. If we call in the resolution for the international community to take decisive action to defend the democratic world order in response to the attack undertaken against it, the Russian Federation and Belarus. There should, of course, be actions, not just words. If we define Russian aggression against Ukraine as an act of unprecedented gravity, we must respond unprecedentedly in turn. If we recognize that unleashing of a war of aggression by a permanent member of United Nations Security Council poses a challenge to global governance, undermining the multilateral system aimed at maintaining peace and security, we must reflect to it more straightforward. Time for nice and sweet diplomacy words has gone by now. Since 21st of February, Instead, to my deepest regret, we have fallen into habitual patterns of recommendations which could be hardly implemented, given most of them would require goodwill of Russia, which is not in place. This is a good wish list, but no more. With all my respect to the work being done on the report by the rapporteur, Frank Schwabe, I cannot hide my frustration that the committee failed yesterday to be more precise in terms of what assistance will be given to Ukraine. It was afraid to include words of military assistance, which was asked by our UK colleagues. What are you afraid of? To reflect the processes which are happening on the wide scale now?
Would you please
Is a recent coordination meeting of 40 defense ministers at the Ramstein air base not convincing evidence for this? Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Olena. No problem. I am a bit more flexible with those who come from Ukraine today. Next on our list is Mr. Anton Gomez Reino from Spain, but I do not see him here. So then, prochaine oratrice est Madame Lucie Monsion de la Canada, mais en ligne. Lucie, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chers collègues parlementaires, nous ne saurions trop souligner l'importance de protéger et préserver le patrimoine et l'héritage culturel de l'Ukraine de la destruction et des dommages infligés dans le cadre de l'invasion par la Russie. Nous sommes tous témoins des effets dévastateurs de cette invasion. Nous avons vu les millions de personnes déplacées et réfugiées, les atrocités commises contre les civils, la destruction quasi totale de plusieurs villes et villages. À cette liste, il faut ajouter la menace qui pèse actuellement sur le patrimoine culturel ukrainien. Selon l'UNESCO, plus d'une centaine de bâtiments et de monuments patrimoniaux ont été endommagés ou détruits depuis le début de l'invasion. En temps de guerre, les biens culturels comme les monuments historiques, les œuvres d'art et les collections scientifiques sont protégés en vertu de la Convention de la Haye de 1954 sur la protection des biens culturels en cas de conflit armé. Cette convention, qui a été ratifiée par la Russie et l'Ukraine, demande que les États membres impliqués dans un conflit agissent de façon à sauvegarder leurs propres biens culturels, notamment en les éloignant des opérations militaires si possible. Elle interdit aussi toute attaque délibérée contre des biens culturels. Pourquoi devrions-nous unir nos efforts afin de préserver le patrimoine culturel ukrainien de la destruction? Parce que, comme l'a souligné dès le début du conflit Audrey Azoulay, directrice générale de l'UNESCO, ce patrimoine culturel témoigne du passé de l'Ukraine et jouera aussi un rôle de réinstauration de la paix et de la cohésion sociale après le conflit. La destruction de monuments et de bâtiments patrimoniaux qui a semblé délibérée pour certains témoins des attaques peut aussi contribuer à fragiliser l'identité ukrainienne et à démoraliser la population. Pour ces raisons, la communauté internationale doit appuyer de toutes les façons possibles la sauvegarde du patrimoine culturel de l'Ukraine. J'aimerais souligner les efforts inlassables de milliers d'Ukrainiens qui ont senti l'urgence de mettre en place des mesures pour protéger leur héritage culturel. Ces personnes ont déplacé des milliers d'œuvres d'art et de biens culturels pour les mettre à l'abri des bombardements, des incendies et du pillage. Elles ont aussi protégé par des sacs de sable et d'autres matériaux des centaines de monuments et de bâtiments patrimoniaux qui ne pouvaient être déplacés. Les Ukrainiens sont appuyés dans leurs efforts de sauvegarde du patrimoine par des milliers de bénévoles provenant de nombreux pays. Par l'entremise du projet Saving Ukrainian Cultural Heritage Online, plus de 1300 bénévoles, dont des bibliothèques, des archivistes et des chercheurs, ont jusqu'à présent relocalisé le contenu de plus de 3500 sites Internet de musées et de bibliothèques de l'Ukraine pour éviter la destruction. En conclusion, j'encourage mes collègues parlementaires à intégrer la sauvegarde du patrimoine culturel ukrainien comme un des volets à l'appui offert à l'Ukraine dans le contexte de l'invasion de la Russie. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci à vous, chère Lucie. Prochain orateur est M. André Gatolin de la France. André, en ligne, je pense. Est-ce qu'il est là?
C'est beaucoup d'émotion et de rage que je m'adresse à vous. Je pense tout particulièrement à nos collègues de la délégation ukrainienne, dont certains peuvent être présents, d'autres se sont engagés aux côtés des forces civiles et militaires pour défendre leur pays. Pendant 7 ans, nous avons ignoré leurs cris d'alarme sur ce qui allait se passer. Et aujourd'hui, nous découvrons la sombre réalité d'une guerre horrible, d'une guerre des plus sales, la plus sale que nous ayons connue sans doute sur ce continent depuis la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Donc je veux leur réaffirmer à la fois ma solidarité, mais aussi le sens de l'action que nous devons avoir. Alors bien sûr, il paraît difficile dans cette assemblée, certes démocratique mais très policée, de parler de sanctions renforcées et surtout d'aide militaire à l'Ukraine. Et c'est la raison pour laquelle, avec de nombreux parlementaires de la Rada suprême d'Ukraine, avec des parlementaires européens, notamment nos amis lituaniens et autour d'Andrius Kubilius, nous avons créé il y a quelques semaines United for Ukraine, Unis pour l'Ukraine. Nous sommes aujourd'hui plus de 200 parlementaires issus de 30 pays, principalement européens, mais pas que, à nous battre pour plusieurs motifs très précis. Un, d'abord, assurer des sanctions renforcées contre la Fédération de Russie. Deux, développer, améliorer l'aide humanitaire à l'égard des populations à l'intérieur de l'Ukraine ou hors de l'Ukraine. Trois, faire en sorte que des armes et des armes réelles, utiles, puissent être fournies aux troupes ukrainiennes pour résister à cette agression insoutenable. Et puis aussi prévoir l'avenir, c'est-à-dire tout faire pour renseigner les éléments, les crimes de guerre qui sont commis, les crimes d'agression qui sont commis, pour demain demander aux responsables de cette agression d'aller devant la justice. Enfin, nous pensons à l'avenir et il faut préparer la reconstruction, l'aide à la reconstruction de ce beau pays qu'est l'Ukraine. Et enfin, il faut penser à l'intégration sous une forme sans doute exceptionnelle, la plus rapide de l'Ukraine au sein de l'Union européenne. Enfin, dernier mot, je voudrais souligner qu'il y a un peu plus de 3 semaines, à Paris, au sein de la réunion du Comité des affaires légales et des droits de l'homme, nous avons, sous la direction de notre chère amie Suna Havertz-Dottir, à propos de la situation des prisonniers politiques en Russie, auditionné plusieurs personnes, donc Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir, 3 jours après son retour en Russie, a été arrêté pour un fait anodin et vient d'être maintenant condamné, attaqué, en tous les cas chargé de propagande contre la guerre ou désinformation. Il risque 15 ans de prison. Alors après avoir fait l'objet de 2 tentatives d'empoisonnement au Novichok, eh bien c'est quelqu'un qui fait confiance au Conseil de l'Europe, qui aujourd'hui se trouve sous le joug d'un pouvoir totalitaire et totalement injuste. Donc je vous demande, mes chers collègues, aussi de nous mobiliser en faveur de Vladimir Kara-Murza. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous, cher André. Now we have again Mr. Jacek Protasevich online. You have the floor, sir.
Well, okay, thank you, Mr. President, not only for giving me the floor, but also for your excellent pronunciation of Polish names, which I assume I am aware are not easy at all. Dear colleagues, allow me to start my intervention with referring to the principal document that our organization is based on, to the Convention for Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. In its preamble, representatives of states, including high officials from the Russian Federation, which signed the convention, declared and reaffirmed their profound belief in fundamental freedoms, which are the foundations of justice and peace in the world. Invading Ukraine, Russia has violated our basic principles written down in the convention, as well as in other fundamental documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly, of which the Russian Federation is still one of key members. By ignoring their commitments, Russian leaders have clearly demonstrated their lack of respect for international law. Their threats of possibly using nuclear weapons are a visible proof that the only arguments they understand are arguments of force, unfortunately. That is why excluding the Russian Federation from the Council of Europe was the right decision. However, that cannot be the only consequence of illegal and unjustified war against Ukraine launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin. Terrifying atrocities committed by Russian soldiers must not be just condemned, but most importantly, severely punished. Also, every decision maker who participated in the decision of the invasion, as well as army commanders being in charge of Russian army operations in Ukraine, must be brought to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, as were those responsible personally and politically for crimes committed during Balkan War in the 90s. I am aware that all who have innocent Ukrainian blood on their hands would be held accountable for the unlawful decisions and war crimes only if the war is ended and justice prevails. That may happen only if Ukraine is not defeated. That's why sanctions on Russia are necessary, and that is why Ukraine must be supported by the international democratic community in all means, including heavy weapons provided to Ukrainian soldiers. It is necessary to emphasize the fact that they are fighting not only for their homeland independence and territorial integrity, but also for our common values, for our freedom, and for our, as well as our children's right to live in a peaceful and safe world.
Thank you very much.
At the end of my contribution, I would like to
Sorry,
thank Mr. Schwab for
now,
his
sorry, sir,
excellent work.
you have now run out of time and we have to be collegial to everybody. Thank you very much for being with us online. Prochaine oratrice est Madame Marina Carobio Guschetti de la Suisse. Marina, vous avez la parole.
Grazie signor Presidente, signori e signori. Ringrazio anche il relatore Frank Schwab per il lavoro svolto, la ricerca anche di un equilibrio e soprattutto per aver messo ancora una volta l'accento sul fatto che l'aggressione russa è un attacco ai nostri valori fondamentali, i nostri valori del Consiglio d'Europa, è un attacco inaccettabile ai diritti umani, alla democrazia e al diritto umano, al diritto internazionale. E oltre evidentemente a ribadire la ferma condanna dell'aggressione russa, a ribadire la necessità di continuare a far pressione sulla Russia per mettere fine alla guerra d'aggressione e ad esprimere ancora una volta la nostra solidarietà con il popolo ucraino. Nella relazione si chiede anche una rapida protezione delle persone in fuga, si chiedono delle misure per prevenire la tratta di esseri umani, per proteggere le persone più vulnerabili e i minori. Ecco quindi che tra le gravi violazioni dei diritti umani troviamo anche le violenze sessuali e lo stupro. Lo stupro è un crimine di guerra, è uno strumento usato come arma per colpire la popolazione ucraina, la popolazione civile, per colpire le donne. Le testimonianze di stupri in Ucraina sono numerose. Un primo rapporto dell'organizzazione non governativa Human Rights Watch documenta le violenze sessuali. C'è una proposta di emendamento che discuteremo poi al punto 11.5 che chiede di inserire un paragrafo per garantire l'accesso dei rifugiati e delle vittime dei crimini di guerra a dei servizi sanitari adeguati, compresa l'interruzione di gravidanza per le vittime di stupro. È un emendamento importante, è un emendamento che vi invito a sostenere. Gli stupri come crimini di guerra sono un oggetto di approfondimento anche in altre relazioni di questo Consiglio. Ed è importante però inserire anche questo aspetto in questa relazione, in quella che discutiamo ora, e di dire come noi, come Consiglio d'Europa, vogliamo rispondere a questi crimini. In concreto, oltre a considerare lo stupro come crimine di guerra e come tale perseguirlo, nei paesi di accoglienza vanno garantite le misure a sostegno delle donne vittime di violenza, l'accesso ai servizi sanitari adeguati e necessari e all'interruzione di gravidanza per le vittime di stupro. Misure che vanno portate avanti dai Paesi membri del Consiglio d'Europa, lavorando evidentemente con le associazioni attive sul territorio a difesa delle donne e, che combattono le violenze sessuali. Quindi grazie anche per considerare questo aspetto.
Merci à vous, Madame. prochain orateur sur notre liste est M. Viorel Ricard Badea de la Roumanie. Vous avez la parole.
Grazie Presidente. Prima di tutto vorrei rivolgere i miei complimenti a Frank Schwab per la sua eccellente relazione. Stiamo già vedendo da 2 mesi, quando è iniziata la guerra dell'aggressione lanciata dalla Federazione Russa contro l'Ucraina, ignorando completamente e violando flagrantemente il diritto internazionale e i suoi obblighi. 2 mesi in cui le conseguenze di natura umanitaria, economica e di sicurezza si fanno sentire in Europa e nel mondo intero. 2 mesi in cui gli Stati membri del Consiglio d'Europa hanno dimostrato una piena solidarietà di azione nel sostegno dell'Ucraina e hanno agito con fermezza e unità nello spirito dei valori e dei principi che ci uniscono. Noi abbiamo mostrato in questo tempo solidarietà, non solitudine, siamo stati solidari, non solitari. Tramite una mobilitazione esemplare delle 2 entità statutarie, dell'Assemblea parlamentare e del Comitato dei Ministri, il nostro Consiglio d'Europa ha dato una risposta ferma ed unitaria davanti a questa provocazione senza precedente nella storia dell'organizzazione. L'Assemblea ha adottato durante la recente sessione straordinaria tramite il voto unanimo dei membri dell'Assemblea, cioè i rappresentanti dei diversi gruppi politici dell'Assemblea, l'avviso, l'opinione numero 300, tramite la quale si è dimostrato il motivo per cui la Russia non può più far parte di Consiglio d'Europa. Il Comitato dei Ministri ha deciso, in base a questo avviso, l'esclusione della Federazione Russa dagli Stati membri. La Russia ha scelto la via della guerra e dell'agire violentemente contro i civili, contro il paese vicino che ha diritto incontestabile moralmente e legalmente di difendersi i confini, i valori e l'identità nazionale. Si dice che c'è una sola verità e tante mistificazioni, lanciate proprio da quelli che cercano di nascondere la verità e di creare delle immagini distorte. Questi tentativi non fanno altro che aumentare la solidarietà tra i paesi del mondo intero, che a loro volta chiedono assieme di fermare questi orrori, che venga interrotta questa guerra. Le azioni di solidarietà con il popolo ucraino prendono diverse forme sia nelle relazioni bilaterali sia nel campo multilaterale e avvertiamo una mobilitazione per unire queste azioni. La Romania ha deciso in questi giorni, assieme ad altri paesi, la riapertura dell'ambasciata di Kiev. A livello più alto, ma anche nel Parlamento, ci sono frequentemente delle riunioni per il coordinamento delle misure che appoggiano l'Ucraina e delle misure di sicurezza. Nella vicinanza della Federazione Russa ci sono altri stati, come la Repubblica Moldova e la Georgia, che sentono la minaccia diretta contro i loro sforzi per il rinforzamento democratico e sentono la messa in pericolo della sicurezza nazionale. Dobbiamo di seguito continuare questi sforzi e continuare di essere solidari per sostenere la pace, la stabilità, la prosperità nello spirito della cooperazione sulla base del diritto e dei nostri ideali comuni. Grazie.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Badea. Next on our list of speakers is Mr. Norbert Kleinwachter from Germany. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Werte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, die erste Nachricht, an die ich mich erinnere, als ich Kind war, das war die Nachricht vom Mauerfall. Das war die Nachricht von der Wiedervereinigung, das war die Nachricht vom Frieden, das war die Nachricht, der Kalte Krieg ist beendet. Jetzt bin ich 36 und ich hätte mir ehrlich gesagt nicht vorstellen können, dass dieser Kalte Krieg noch mal heiß wird. Aber in dieser Situation sind wir und können wir sein. Und das stelle ich mit großem Entsetzen fest. Und meine Gebete sind in dieser Zeit dieses grauenhaften Angriffskriegs bei den vielen ukrainischen Familien, die davon getroffen sind, aber auch bei den russischen Eltern, deren Söhne sinnlos und unter größter Propaganda verheizt werden in diesem Krieg. Liebe Kollegen, viele von Ihnen haben Sanktionen angesprochen, Waffenlieferungen angesprochen. Und ich möchte an dieser Stelle ganz bewusst einmal meine Rede diesen Menschen geben, die sich stark für den Frieden einsetzen, die sagen, das ist vielleicht nicht die richtige Lösung, Waffen zu liefern, die ein bisschen Angst haben vielleicht vor der Waffenlieferung, die Angst haben davor, dass dieser Krieg, der im Moment noch in der Ukraine ist, tatsächlich eskaliert und sich ausweitet. Liebe Kollegen, und ich glaube, dass wir tatsächlich, bevor wir so etwas in den Bericht hineinschreiben, dass wir Waffen liefern, dass Sanktionen richtig sein sollten, eigentlich den Frieden in den Vordergrund stellen. Wir sind 318 Abgeordnete und 318 Stellvertreter. Das sind im Prinzip 636 politisch profilierte Politiker, Menschen, die hier sind. 636 potenzielle Gesprächskanäle. Wenn 635 Kanäle scheitern und auch nur einer erfolgreich wäre, dann hätten wir wesentlich mehr für den Frieden, für den wir eigentlich stehen, getan, als wenn wir hier gegen Russland wettern, verdientermaßen. Aber im Endeffekt Dinge fordern, die auf nationaler Ebene entschieden werden müssen, die jedes Land für sich selbst entschieden werden muss. Und so sehr uns diese Gespräche widerstreben, ich möchte Sie auffordern, sie trotzdem zu suchen. Denn wenn wir da einen Erfolg haben, dann bringt das wesentlich mehr als jeder Panzer. Und der Grund, warum ich sage, dass diese Dinge auf nationaler Ebene entschieden werden müssen, das ist, dass wir unterschiedliche politische und rechtliche, aber auch wirtschaftliche Voraussetzungen haben. Es ist schon leicht zu fordern, dass man irgendwie ein Gas- und Ölembargo macht, aber was würde das zum Beispiel für Deutschland bedeuten? Wir haben eigentlich noch Lieferverträge. 140 Milliarden würden wir dann Russland schenken. Es gibt ja Mindestabnahmemengen bis 2030. Wollen wir das wirklich oder kippen wir mal eben die Rechtsstaatlichkeit raus, dass wir sagen, ja gut, das ist ein zivilrechtlicher Vertrag, das gilt jetzt nicht mehr im Krieg. Wollen wir das wirklich argumentieren? Oder in Bezug auf Waffenlieferungen haben wir natürlich das Problem, dann wird man zur Kriegspartei. Dann gibt es auch die Situation, was ist, wenn ein geliehener, geschenkter Panzer vielleicht getroffen wird, sind wir dann im Krieg? Liebe Freunde, ich möchte einfach auffordern, lasst uns hier nicht für Waffen stehen und nicht für Sanktionen. Lasst uns hier für den Dialog und für den Frieden stehen. Und ich appelliere an alle, sich dafür einzusetzen. Vielen Dank.
Danke sehr, Herr Kleinwechsler. Next on my list of speakers is Madam Anna-Marie Virolainen from Finland. Are you with us? That is not the case. So, prochain orateur à mon liste est Monsieur Damien Cotier de la Suisse. Oh, sorry, I made a mistake, Damien. Madam Virolainen is online. Sorry, Anne-Marie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to express my utmost respect to Ukraine in the fight for freedom, not only for yourself, but for all of us. I pay homage to every fallen Ukrainian who has resisted Russians' completely unjustified attack to a sovereign country. The Russian Federation has committed systematic and massive war crimes. Russia has carried out murders, enforced disappearances, deportations, imprisonments, torture, rape, and mass desecration of corpses. Dear colleagues, this Russian Federation's ongoing aggression against Ukraine is genocide. It is nothing else but a crime against humanity. In the face of this brutal attack on peace and security, international law, and the most basic values of the Council of Europe, I most strongly advocate the pace that we make a powerful international call for supporting Ukraine in order to cease Russian aggression. The pace shall call on countries around the world to increase their military assistance and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Call on countries to immediately strengthen the sanctions against the Russian Federation by adding energy imports to the list. Call on national parliaments and international organizations to recognize these crimes against the Ukrainian people as genocide. And last but not least, shall support investigation of Russian crimes, prosecution of the perpetrators, and establishing an international court for this purpose. Mr. President, the Council of Europe and its member states' response to the challenge imposed by Russia leaves a mark to European history and to our future. The Council of Europe can display a strong, unified act. We are in the front line to support Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Le prochain orateur maintenant est M. Damien Cotier de la Suisse. Damien.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Lors de notre session extraordinaire, nous avons parlé de cette attaque brutale contre le droit international et contre l'ordre juridique d'après-guerre, et nous devons hélas continuer de nous en occuper et nous en sommes d'autant plus désolés que cette violence a été causée par un membre permanent du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, un État qui, au fond, est censé être un des garants de la paix au niveau international, et c'est l'inverse qui se passe. Et depuis lors, nous avons non seulement constaté le début d'un conflit horrible, mais de crimes horribles qui sont commis sur le terrain, probablement des crimes de guerre, des atrocités en tous les cas, qui sont clairement interdites par le droit international humanitaire et aussi par la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme, qui, rappelons-le, s'applique pleinement sur l'ensemble du territoire de l'Ukraine et s'applique encore pleinement jusqu'au 16 septembre sur l'entier du territoire de la Fédération de Russie. Lorsque Henri Dunant a pris l'initiative, avec l'appui du gouvernement suisse à l'époque, d'inviter des États en 1864 à Genève pour établir ce qui a été la première convention de Genève, et la Russie était d'ailleurs un des gouvernements qui était présent à cette conférence internationale, l'idée était de ramener un peu d'humanité au cœur de la guerre, au cœur des conflits. Et ce que nous constatons actuellement, c'est l'inverse qui se passe malheureusement sur le terrain et nous devons le condamner avec les mots les plus fermes possibles. Cela nous oblige parce que nous sommes responsables de cela, nous sommes garants dans cette institution de la Convention européenne des droits de l'homme et l'ensemble de nos pays, nous sommes tous parlementaires nationaux, l'ensemble de nos pays ont signé les conventions de Genève, elles ont été signées par l'ensemble des États de cette planète, elles ont donc une valeur universelle. Et ces conventions de Genève, elles obligent chaque État non seulement à respecter les règles du droit international humanitaire, mais aussi à faire respecter le droit international humanitaire. Nous avons donc une obligation non seulement morale, mais juridique d'agir. On ne peut que s'inquiéter de voir les dérives actuelles et aussi les déclarations extrêmement inquiétantes des dernières heures. J'aimerais aussi ici remercier le rapporteur pour ce débat, me réjouir que nous ayons aussi demain un autre débat sur les conséquences juridiques de ces atrocités. Les deux rapports se complètent. Globalement, je les soutiens. Il y a des demandes d'intervention des différents pays. Je souligne simplement qu'ils doivent le faire dans le cadre de leurs obligations juridiques. Je viens par exemple de la Suisse, un État neutre de manière permanente. Et le droit de la neutralité est défini par les règles des conventions de La Haye et impose un certain nombre d'obligations et aussi un certain nombre de restrictions. Il est par exemple interdit pour un pays comme le mien d'exporter des armes. Par contre, elle exporte un autre type d'aide. Elle accueille un grand nombre de réfugiés. Elle exporte aussi beaucoup d'aide humanitaire. Et la population suisse s'est mobilisée pour verser plus de 100 millions de francs suisses, qui est l'équivalent de 100 millions d'euros en quelques jours. Et le gouvernement suisse a doublé la somme. Enfin, un mot pour dire que la situation interne en Fédération de Russie est très inquiétante, avec notamment l'emprisonnement de M. Karamurza. Nous en avons parlé hier à la Commission des affaires juridiques. J'ai fait un statement aujourd'hui au nom de la Commission pour demander sa libération immédiate, parce que c'est absolument inacceptable.
Merci, Damien. Next on my list is Mr. Antonio Guterres Limones from Spain. Antonio, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, presidentes. Queridos colegas, hoy se cumplen 85 años del bombardeo de Guernica que pintó Picasso. El presidente Zelensky, en la reunión que mantuvo con el Parlamento español, dijo que Guernica era lo más parecido a lo que estaba pasando con las ciudades en Ucrania. Quiero felicitar a Frank por este informe, cuya intención es hacer un llamamiento a esta Asamblea para pasar a la acción de manera decidida, y agradecer a nuestro presidente, a Tiny Cox, por poner en marcha todos los instrumentos que esta Asamblea es capaz de desplegar para frenar la terrible agresión de Putin al pueblo ucraniano. Nuestra obligación como representantes de los ciudadanos es hacer lo que debemos hacer, a pesar de las consecuencias personales, a pesar de los obstáculos, los peligros y las presiones, pues esa es la base de la moral humana. Una vez más, el enemigo tiene nombre y apellidos. Nos enfrentamos de nuevo al delirio de una persona, pero quiero también que seamos de una vez por todas conscientes del peligro real que representa Putin. Un riesgo que no está solo en nuestra frontera, sino que lleva más de una década desplegando sus planes de desestabilización en Europa. Acciones organizadas, metódicas, y a los que viene dedicando cuantiosos recursos que han tratado de acabar con el proyecto de construcción común europeo. Nos hemos despertado con el grito de drama y terror de Ucrania, pero hemos sido destinatarios de ataques directos a nuestras instituciones democráticas desde Moscú, sin que se haya producido la debida reacción unida de todos nosotros. Ahora que hemos despertado, Debemos dejar claro que la Rusia de Putin ha puesto en marcha diversas campañas de desinformación para interferir en los procesos electorales europeos en beneficio de partidos que están en contra del orden democrático internacional. Tenemos todos la obligación de denunciar los numerosos casos de injerencia rusa, entre los que cabe destacar la campaña del Brexit, las elecciones presidenciales en Francia y Alemania y el referéndum ilegal en Cataluña, entre otros, prestando apoyo a formaciones antieuropeas, ultraderechistas e independentistas que pretenden acabar con los estados democráticos. Situaciones en las que, por desgracia, no siempre esta Asamblea ha estado a la altura, dando pábulo a posiciones promovidas por Putin antes de defender los intereses de estados democráticos que eran agredidos. Difíciles momentos que hemos vivido aquí. Yo, como parlamentario del Parlamento español, he sufrido la falta de unidad imprescindible ante procesos independentistas que vulneraban la Constitución democrática española y detrás de las que estaban los intereses de desestabilización de Putin. Han tenido que sonar los tambores de guerra para que despertemos y seamos conscientes de los riesgos que suponen las intenciones de Putin. No esperemos más. Utilicemos todos nuestros instrumentos para apoyar a Ucrania y a su pueblo y desmontemos todas las campañas de desinformación que nuestro enemigo ha puesto en marcha para cambiar el sentido de nuestro modelo de convivencia. Podemos ser cómplices por acción o por omisión, como a veces hemos sido. No permitamos que sus mensajes populistas le hagan a Putin el trabajo sucio. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Antonio. Now I call in the debate from Norway, Madam Linda Helleland. You have the floor, Madam.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, this war affects us all Europeans, but the effect on Ukrainian women, men, and children, especially those who fall victim to sexual violence and rape, is unimaginable. Ukrainians are victims of such crimes. They are traumatized and scared for life. Rape results in unwanted pregnancies. All countries that receive and host refugees from Ukraine must provide counseling and care. Safe abortions must be provided to those in need. I am afraid that the situation will get worse before it gets better. Millions of Ukrainians are in need of our help and assistance in Ukraine and in our member states. They need help now. Civil societies and NGOs must contribute in the care of victims. They can provide counseling and therapy alongside healthcare professionals. The police in all member states play a crucial role. They must be especially attentive to these vulnerable groups. They must secure evidence. They must ensure that vulnerable groups don't fall victim to crime and exploitation in their host countries. The international community must do what we can do to ensure that there is no impunity for war crimes. Killing of civilians, rape, and sexual violence must be investigated, documented, and prosecuted. The perpetrators must be punished. President, in March we established the network Women at Pace. And I ask you all, especially the men here in the Assembly, to take our statement back to your countries. Demand that your governments do everything in their power to prevent and combat violence against women and children. Demand that the use of sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war is investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice. Demand that women and girls who became pregnant after being assaulted are given psychological support and health care. I would also like to point out that my political group, the EPP, has taken the initiative to found the Women's Group, and I would like to stress that one of our first initiatives will be dedicated to women survivors of war and how we as parliamentarians can help them. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Linda, and thank you for referring to our informal network Women in Peace. Now I call in the debate Mr. Alexander Christiansson from Sweden. Alexander, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. In this brief statement, I wish to focus specifically on a number of long-term, more mental impacts, first and foremost among the literally shell-shocked population of Ukraine. For example, thousands of babies have been born in underground shelters, lacking nourishment and kept away by artillery shells exploding above them, with the ground shaking below them, and crying and horrified people crouching around them. Will they and countless other Ukrainian citizens in similar heart-rending situations over the last 2 months, presumably with more to come, will they ever be able to regain their mental stability and calm? One thing is certain, though. It will take a very long time and require enormous efforts. And how will Ukrainians, after peace returns, regard their Russian neighbors, since the two countries will always remain geographical neighbors? This holds even as Ukrainians know that it was not ordinary Russians who orchestrated the invasion, but rather Mr. Putin himself and his small clique of advisors. There is another mental impact that should be mentioned, namely the apprehension now prevailing in all the countries that neighbor or are near Russia. In these countries, the earlier climate of relative trust in and readiness to cooperate with Russia is gone. In its place has come a climate of fear that these countries themselves may be next in line to be invaded. So I am now glad that we have come together like never before, in order to jointly preserve and defend our precious national freedoms and independence. To mention an example, my own country, Sweden, as well as neighboring Finland, we are just now debating whether we should join NATO. Elsewhere in Europe, defense budgets are being rapidly expended to meet the new perceived threat. Finally, Mr. President, the discontent with this war is slowly but surely moving into Russia itself. The Russian people is gradually realizing now how brutal and catastrophic the unprovoked attack on Ukraine really is. And I hope and trust that someday they will hold its leadership accountable for it. With this being said, I'm really glad that we are standing together for Ukraine in this time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Alexander. Prochaine oratrice est Madame Nicole Duraton de la France. Nicole, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues. Je remercie notre collègue Frank Schwab pour son excellent rapport très complet. Et je veux en préambule rendre hommage à nos collègues et amis ukrainiens dont l'engagement au Conseil de l'Europe est remarquable. Dans un contexte particulièrement difficile pour leur pays, cet engagement nous oblige. À ce stade du débat, beaucoup a déjà été dit. Je concentrerai donc mon intervention sur quelques points. Comme beaucoup, je me félicite que nous ayons collectivement su faire preuve d'unité dans la réponse à apporter à l'invasion de l'Ukraine par la Fédération russe. Le vote de notre Assemblée a été clair. La réaction du Comité des ministres aussi. C'était nécessaire et cela doit nous guider pour la suite, y compris pour nous pousser à aiguiller les différentes instances du Conseil de l'Europe lorsqu'elles n'interviennent pas de manière suffisamment réactive. Notre collègue Frank Schwab a appelé à sortir des sentiers battus lorsque c'est nécessaire. Ça l'a été effectivement dans ces circonstances exceptionnelles. Je relève des points de satisfaction à cet égard. Je pense à l'action de la Banque de développement du Conseil de l'Europe qui est intervenue très rapidement, tout comme l'action mise en place pour soutenir les services de la procureure générale d'Ukraine afin de documenter et rassembler les preuves de violation du droit international humanitaire. Posons-nous la question. Le Conseil est-il toujours à la hauteur? Malheureusement, je ne le crois pas. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Vous avez conduit une délégation des présidents de groupe de notre Assemblée en Ukraine, et c'était essentiel. Mais en revanche, notre secrétaire général, notre commissaire aux droits de l'homme ne se sont pas encore rendus. Les explications qui nous ont été données m'apparaissent peu convaincantes. De même, j'ai interpellé notre secrétaire général sur la réouverture du bureau à Kiev et j'avoue avoir été déçue par sa réponse par trop administrative. Il y a urgence. Je pense que notre Assemblée doit jouer un rôle d'aiguillon dans la durée afin que l'ensemble du Conseil de l'Europe assume pleinement son devoir. Je vous remercie.
Merci à vous, chère Nicole. The next speaker on our list is Madam Clotilda Bushka from Albania. Clotilda, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, let me first congratulate Mr. Schwabe for this excellent report. I think the report is well inclusive of all the issues, and I have just a call for all of us here and for our parliaments that we do what we have been called to do based on this recommendation and draft resolution that we will vote later on. I want to stop in 3 questions. The first question is related to the leadership that is requested from the member states of the Council of Europe to organize the 4th summit of head of states and government of Council of Europe member states to reaffirm the values of democracy, human rights and the rule of law, and elaborate a new vision for the organization in the context of the European multilateral architecture. I would say that my country stands for this, and I can confirm here the will of the Albanian Parliament and, of course, of the Albanian government to stand with the Council of Europe in fulfilling this, as we have stood inside with NATO and the Security Council of the United Nations in order to help Ukraine escape from that horrible war that is happening nowadays. The other one is related to the financial stability of the Council of Europe. Once again, allow me to tell that Albania, as many other countries that are members in the Council of Europe, will do what is possible for it, and even more, in order to invest that the activity of the Council of Europe, specifically in the cases related to help Ukraine and its people, be realized in a very short term. The third issue which is important is the situation of women in Ukraine. They are the most risky part of the situation, of the population there, and what I need to call all of the mechanisms in the Council of Europe that take care for the women's rights. Please, can we do something more, not just declaration and statements? Missions are being created to investigate and to make fact-finding missions, but I think Gravio, other mechanisms in the Council of Europe can do more, not only to help victims rehabilitate, but we need to do something more in order that the sexual violation, the rapes that we are hearing every day, be stopped. And this is something that I think we can do it every day, not only when we have the plenary session at this very honored fora. That's why I call on all the women parliamentarians here. I would be very happy to congratulate even the APP women that started their own group of women MPs, that to unite together with all women, as in Women in Pace, and really start some side events and push all the international mechanism on that regard, do something every day, not only when we have meetings and plenary. Thank you very much, and Slava Ukraine.
Thank you, Clotilda. And now I welcome in the debate our good colleague Sergei Sobolev. You are with us here, Sergei. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just arrived 4 hours from Ukraine to Strasbourg, and it's impossible to understand this situation where it's other air, other trees, blows in trees. It's other sun. It's not so red from the blood of our children and our women. It's not so black from the attack of Russian missiles. As well, for example, for me, it's impossible to understand how it's to be under the rocket and bomb attacks in Mariupol each 10 minutes. Each 10 minutes. It's impossible to understand how Russian soldiers, after the sexual violence, when they denazify and demilitarize Ukrainian women and children, it's the term of Putin, discussing with their wives and mothers, what do you want to bring to you from Bucha or from Gostomel to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, You want this dress or you want these shoes? When they are discussing with their children, my dear son, you are 6 years old. I want to give you teddy bear from killed Ukrainian boy. It's impossible to understand this in a real mentality. I think it's very important to understand how we are living now in Ukraine. When I was woke up at 6 in the morning in my native city, Zaporizhia, half of this region is occupied by Russians, by 2 rockets attacks just in the middle of the city. When I came to Odessa, the biggest bridge that united 2 parts of Odessa, where it's a real way of life, where hundreds and hundreds of cars with wheat, corn are going to Europe, was dismissed by Russian aviation. It's also denazification and demilitarization. When I came to the capital of Moldova and spent 7 hours in airport together with other hundreds and hundreds of people who are waiting for different flights, and we are listening for new provocation of Putin in the part of Moldova, Transnistria. And we are thinking what it will be. Maybe they will attack the capital of Moldova. I think we need to discuss this in such a manner. When we as an organization that is not NATO, it's not a European country, but it's a main organization that protects human rights, we need to organize the process against Putin and his regime in order to stop this forever. Because we will have Mariupol, not in Mariupol, but in Paris, in other cities. I think it's very serious, and we must understand this all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey, and take care, stay safe and sound. Now, online, we will hear the intervention of Mr. Francesco Sorbara from Canada. Francesco, you have the floor.
Good afternoon to everyone, our friends and allies in Europe. Here in the nation's capital, where we're currently sitting, I do want to state that we are home to one of the largest diasporas of Ukrainian people outside the Ukraine, and we stand steadfast with Ukrainian people and for the sovereignty, the full sovereignty and democracy of Ukraine. Honorable colleagues, we are rightly seized with the horrifying images and stories emerging from Ukrainian communities that have been liberated from Russian occupation, and with ensuring that possible war crimes are investigated. As a clear sign of that brutality, we have witnessed in a matter of weeks the worst displacement crisis in Europe since the Second World War. As this war continues and as the toll on Ukraine's people continues to mount, we are also becoming concerned with its broader ramifications. One is the war's potential to exacerbate global food insecurity, The vulnerabilities within Ukraine are already apparent, and there are already heightened risks of food insecurity for the millions of people who have been displaced internally through Russia's unprovoked aggression. Ukraine's infrastructure and agricultural land have been damaged, its ports have been blocked, and harvesting and planting operations may be disrupted. There are also warning signs of global ripple effects. Food prices, according to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, had already reached an all-time high internationally before the war due to market conditions and high prices for inputs. The food price index, which the FAO has maintained since 1990, reached a new record in February, only to be surpassed again in March. Russia and Ukraine are important producers of sunflower seeds, barley and wheat and fertilizers, and energy prices have also spiked. Even in a scenario where the war ends soon, the World Food Program, the WFP, estimates there will be an additional 33 million people facing acute hunger in the 81 countries where the WFP operates. If the war continues beyond April 22, their estimate rises to 47 million people. Here, I would underline that 276 million people around the world were already facing acute hunger before the war. While there are many other projections and analysis that could inform our debate, The potential consequences for lower income states that are heavily dependent on food imports are obvious to all. The fundamental connections between hunger, conflict, and instability were drawn when the World Food Programme was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In response, colleagues, steps can be taken, a few which include diversifying food supplies, supporting vulnerable groups, and strengthening market transparency and supply chains. The Canadian government and parliamentarians, and along with our allies, are seized with determining how we can mitigate the impact that Russia's war of aggression is having on food security. Today, in the difficult weeks to come, I look forward to hearing your thoughts about how can we become more resilient against these shocks together. Dear colleagues, we hope our delegation hopes to be with you soon in person as we are now officially allowed to travel. I wish everyone a wonderful day. Thank you, and God bless Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and indeed we hope to see you here in person in our next session. Now I call on the debate Mr. Domagoj Hajdukovic from Croatia. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, what is happening in Ukraine as we speak is an outrage. And even this word is an understatement, but I don't have a better word for it in English if I am to remain polite. The scale of loss of life, humanitarian situation, massacres we have seen in Ukraine, it is just outrageous. And I'm being polite because no other word springs to mind that can describe how I feel at the moment when I see those pictures and see these reports. The repercussions of the Russian aggression on Ukraine will be felt, of course, in Ukraine, in its neighborhood, on our continent, worldwide, and even by this bilateral organization. We have thrown the Russian Federation out of our assembly, and it was a good move. We should draw the red lines, and the red lines can't be crossed. We must send the clear message. But this is not nearly enough. Do you honestly believe that a regime that values human life, as they have shown us in Bucha or Irpin, in Kramatorsk, will be moved by being thrown out of this organization? No, they will not. Therefore, we must take further steps. They must face the repercussions of their actions. The perpetrators of the massacres and the war crimes must be punished. The outrage to the civil society, not only in Russia, but also in Belarus, must be maintained. And we must explore the ways to communicate with the civil society, with freedom fighters and democratic forces in those countries. Because not all of its citizens support these actions. We should lend them support in fighting for what is right. Furthermore, a clear European perspective for Ukraine must be given. I think that the candidacy status for Ukraine would be a kind of a symbolic gesture, really a support, a clear message that we see Ukraine in a European family in the near future. Of course, this is only just the beginning of the European way. There is still a way to go, but this would be a clear message. Let us not forget Georgia in this respect, that faced similar circumstances in 2008. We must extend the support to them as well. And to Moldova. Let's not forget Moldova, who could be next. And finally, let me finish in Ukrainian. Mir Ukraini, Svoboda Ukraini, Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Mr. Hajdukovic. Now I call in the debate Mr. Dmitry Nataluka from Ukraine. You have the floor, Dmitry.
Hello. Thank you very much, dear Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, and thank you for the rapporteur for producing this report. And I would say it's a decent defensive paper. And as you might know, it's almost impossible to win any fight with simply some defensive tools. So what I would love to do is to make this report and this draft resolution more offensive, to make it viable in order to counter the Russian aggression in this common war of ours. And I say common because Ukraine is fighting not only for its territory or citizens. that Russia is trying to subdue since 2014. Ukrainians are dying literally every day for the Western values of freedom and independence, for the European tradition of democracy and diversity, for an open society built on rules, agreements, and friendship, and not on coercion, lies, fear. We are fighting for all that is dear to Europe, to this continent, to Ukraine, and for all that Putin's Russia hates so much. Putin's Russia that is a product of unpunished evil, and we need to set a precedent to punish it properly. As much as this report says that the aggression is an unprecedented act of gravity, we should then provide an unprecedented response. Unprecedented because who knows who might be next? We have heard about Moldova. We have seen what is happening in Transnistria today. And I don't think anyone would dare to call us crazy anymore or traumatized like they used to call us, the Balts, the Poles, and other countries before the Russian aggression. We're not traumatized, we're realists. And the reality is that Moldova, who is not a member of NATO, might easily be the next one tomorrow. So we need to provide a precedent for punishment. We need to make another blitzkrieg in terms of the response. And we all have seen what happens when a blitzkrieg fails. Putin got into very, very serious trouble in Ukraine and started the war of attrition. We don't want our blitzkrieg in terms of responses to fail. We don't need any war of attrition in terms of the sanctions, believe me. Ukraine is the country who is the most interested to end this war as fast as possible and without dragging any other country into it. But then we need to be decisive, and this collective action needs to be very firm, very urgent, unconditional. We need to provide military assistance, we need to impose all the possible sanctions, and finally, we have to demonstrate bravery. A lot of words have been said here in terms of bravery of the Ukrainian people. Let's demonstrate bravery of the European people here. Let us produce some document that we all will be proud of when we will be talking to our grandchildren in decades. Let us produce some document that our grandchildren will be referring to as an act of pure bravery. Let us not leave after our generation the debt of bravery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitro. Next speaker in our list is Madam Katja Dekanovic from Georgia. Katja, you have the floor.
Mr. President, well, first of all, I want to thank Mr. Schwab for the report and very essential and important issues highlighted in there. Yes, it must be the primary goal to act according to civilized standards as Europe, as international organizations. And indeed, we have a great role and responsibility to respond to Russian aggression in Ukraine, killings, rape, bombing, and Russian Federation desire to exterminate Ukrainians. We have a pronounced task to make Putin accountable, as well as every Russian who committed war crimes, genocide in Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, and some other Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian public defender made a statement just recently, and I watched the statement, that about 500,000 Ukrainians had been kidnapped from occupied territories. About 100,000 kids have been forcefully taken to Russia. For many of us who have seen Russian occupation, and you know I'm from Georgia also, and 25% of Georgian territory is occupied. It's not easy to stay with cold mind, and I totally understand Sergei and my colleagues when they're so emotional. Yes, I've seen that. I've seen that in 2008. But sitting here in Agora, let's be dedicated to support investigation and creative, effective tools, punish every Russian soldier committed crimes, every Russian general, and make accountable and punish Putin himself. We have to work and fight fiercely to achieve justice for Ukrainians. Individuals from Russia can be prosecuted in national courts for war crimes, the basis of the principles on universal jurisdiction. In certain countries, for instance, individuals can also be found guilty of the international crime of aggression. And here, what we can do here. Sanctions. First, sanctions. Sanctions must be increased. Civilized world must sanction all the banks. Some of still operating in Russia, I have to remind you. And every single person who continues to support Russian financial market, who continue to keep ties with Russian oligarch. And let me remind you that I represent beautiful, amazing Georgia. And the shadow oligarchy is under Georgian, and that Georgian oligarch Ivanishvili still have ties with Russian oligarchs. Arm Ukraine. It is very much important. Work with our parliament to give more weapons in Ukraine because they have desire to defend their countries. And dear colleagues, let me remind you that we had been warning world again in 2008 that there would be a great risk for Europe. And finally, support EU integration of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. People of these countries had chosen the path to Europe. Let us be the part of your family. It is our family too. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you, Katja. Next speaker on our list is Madam Fiona O'Loughlin from Ireland. Fiona, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. There's no doubt that the world changed on the 24th of February, and this Assembly acted quickly and correctly in terms of making the unanimous decision that Russia should not be a member of the Council of Europe in terms of them having broken every rule in the book about human rights, democracy and the rule of law. My own country has shown great leadership. My colleagues, Senator Timmy Dooley and Member of the European Parliament, Billy Kelleher, have both visited the Ukraine on 2 occasions, and indeed our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, I think was the first Minister for Foreign Affairs to visit. Our Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, led the way in ensuring that Ukrainians fleeing the war of aggression could come to our country without visas and be given as many supports as possible. We have listened here during the week in particular to the female members of PACE from the Ukraine, who have been such strong ambassadors in terms of giving us living testimony to the terrors that the Ukrainian people are facing. And I really applaud them for their courage and their conviction and their incredible strength that they have shown both here and in telling the world about what's happening in the Ukraine. A few short weeks ago, we celebrated in my country the anniversary, the 106th anniversary of our state. And the spirit of the founders of our country is also central to that sense of solidarity which Irish people feel towards others like the Ukrainians who are trying to secure their freedoms and to face down the forces of imperialism. The inhumane war of the Putin regime against Ukraine represents an attempt to assert the right of a powerful country to dominate its neighbours and to crush very basic democratic and human rights. And of course, it's part of an ongoing attempt to roll back the great advances achieved in the last number of years and to undermine cooperation between free democracies, which is the hallmark of what the Council of Europe stands for. Ireland stands with Ukraine and its determination to not just survive this brutal onslaught, but also to be prosperous, successful and secure as part of the European community of nations. When you look at the arguments being used by Russia today, it should scare any country in the world which has struggled to achieve independence. According to Russia, large and powerful countries should have a right to directly control any area close to them. That is absolutely shocking. Ukraine's struggle is our struggle. And that's why we will continue to host people fleeing the conflict. And we will continue to absolutely support the freely elected President Zelensky and government. And we will never accept the idea that Russia has the right to control any part of Ukraine. There can be no more frozen conflicts where brute force imposes conditions on countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry that I had to interrupt you, but it's a matter of solidarity with the others. Next on our list would be Mr. Givi Mikanadze from Georgia, but I do not see him on his place, so we go to the Mr. Jerome. He is here. You are here. Then you get the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear Mr. President, since the very first day of Russia's military aggression in Ukraine, Georgia has been providing its firm support to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, expressed through political support and humanitarian aid. We are again condemning Russia's unprovoked and unjustified military aggression against Ukraine. From a political point of view, Georgia was a co-sponsor of the UN Security Council resolution and was among 141 countries that adopted the UN resolution reaffirming Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity. Additionally, Georgia was one of 38 signatory countries that applied to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to investigate war crimes committed in Ukraine during Russia's unlawful invasion. Georgia supported the suspension of the membership and later expulsion of the Russian Federation from the membership of the Council of Europe. Georgia supported the PACE opinion on the consequences of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. Georgia is a leader among 191 countries per capita in the provision of humanitarian aid to Ukraine. By 1st April 2022, Georgia has provided Ukraine with 400 tons of humanitarian aid, and this process is continued. By 31st March 2022, Georgia has received more than 30,000 refugees from Ukraine, who on a basis of the decision of the government are provided with free accommodation, meals and all necessary assistance, including health care. Russian aggression in Ukraine is substantially altering global security, and the South Caucasus is no exception. In parallel with Russia's unlawful invasion of Ukraine, the intensification of the process of annexation of the occupied territories of Georgia and the continuation of provocations on the ground by Russia is even more worrisome and seriously complicates the situation in the occupied regions. Therefore, I welcome that this crucial general policy debate on the consequences of the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine is at the center of the spring plenary session of the PACE, as well as an urgent debate on ensuring accountability for serious violations of international humanitarian law. Georgia, as a member of a civilized world and a friend of Ukraine, suffered from Russia's unjustified military aggression in 2008, whose 20% of territories are still occupied by Russia, with Russian troops illegally present, understands better than others all consequences of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, which undermines European security architecture and the rule-based international order. Therefore, I call the Assembly to reaffirm unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its territorially recognized borders, as well as express our full support and solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Givi. And now we go to Mr. Jerome Mayhew from the United Kingdom. Jerome, you have the floor.
Mr. President, the extraordinary act of aggression by Russia took me personally profoundly by surprise. I had assumed that an imperial land grab in Europe was confined to our history books. I had assumed that in the modern information age, a nation could not be led into such an evil act. I had assumed that the people would not stand for it, but I was wrong. It has happened, and Russians, in their millions, are choosing to believe the lies of their president. There is a choice here. In large part, the truth is available to the people of Russia via the internet, and yet propaganda is winning. This is a profoundly disturbing truth. When the institutions of democracy are corrupted, the truth on its own is not enough. If we learn anything from Mr. Putin, it should be this, that our democratic institutions are vitally important, that this institution
is vitally important. The checks and balances to executive power, an independent judiciary defending the rule of law, independent journalism, free elections, allowing for the peaceful transfer of power. These checks and balances, sometimes messy, often inconvenient, they are all that stand between us and him. Let's take this lesson back home. Let's make Putin's legacy the renaissance of our own democracies. He will hate it. As for the report, I support it as far as it goes, but regret that it does not have the courage of its convictions, the courage of our convictions, and set out in black and white the need for military support to be provided to Ukraine. The time for calls for peace is not when an invader is occupying large parts of its neighbour. First, we should do all we can to help the Ukrainians to repulse Russia. Then is the time for a just peace.
Thank you very much, Jerome. Now, Madam Inka Hopsu from Finland is joining us online. Inka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, and thank you for Mr. Schwabe for the excellent report. The consequences of war are endless. Human suffering, destruction, environmental catastrophe, and death. Preventing future wars was the reason for founding this organization more than 70 years ago. Yet, here we are. The effects of Russia's war in Ukraine are unfolding before our very eyes. Ukraine urgently needs humanitarian assistance and aid, as well as support in resolving war crimes. However, the consequences of this unnecessary and unfounded war are not limited to Ukraine or even to Europe. It will be felt all over the globe, creating new security risks as people are beginning to suffer from the soaring food prices. Russia's war in Ukraine presents never-before-seen consequences for global agriculture and food security. The war is disrupting markets for final agricultural products and affect availability and prices of bread and cooking oil, which are primary sources of calories for millions of people. Fertilizer shortages and soaring costs prevent wealthier and low and middle income countries from increasing their own food production to compensate for losses in food imports. We have not yet seen the peak of this developing food crisis, but its political consequences have already been felt in countries such as Pakistan, Peru, and Egypt. As the situation unfolds, we might see famine and increase in unrest in the Middle East and parts of Africa, even in Europe. So what can we do? We must stop this war. Let me be very clear. This means that we must stop financing Putin's war. Since the start of the war, the EU has spent approximately 30 billion euros on Russian fossil fuel imports, a huge sum that indirectly pays for the killing of thousands of innocent civilians and the destruction of a whole country. This is completely unsustainable and unacceptable. Energy is a climate change and security issue. Yet the threat of climate change has not led to rapid action on energy transition. Russia's war on Ukraine has exposed the dangers of single-source energy reliance. The Finnish government recently introduced an €850 million crisis package to phase out the use of fossil fuels and achieve energy self-sufficiency. To further speed up this process, we can all reduce energy consumption by changing our own behavior. This will not be enough, but it certainly is one step to stop funding the aggressor and to save the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Inka. Now we are going to listen to the contribution of Mr. Dara Kaleri from Ireland. Dara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. As an Irish person, it is in our DNA to understand what it is like to be threatened by a larger, more militarily powerful neighbour and to stand up to that threat. And that is why we stand as a people in more ways than one with the people of Ukraine in their current situation. I want to commend Mr. Schwabe and the Secretariat, because behind every good rapporteur is an excellent Secretariat from the Political Affairs Committee on his report. The accompanying report to the resolutions in front of us is quite detailed and quite worth reading, and it contains a number of major issues. Many of those issues will be considered, Mr. President, but I want to look at some of them in particular. Part 6 lays out the responsibilities of this institution and this organisation as we move forward. On the 15th of March, we left here with a very definitive decision to expel Russia. For the first time, a member state was expelled. What will we leave here with this week? Yes, we have a very solid report, a very ambitious report. But like many other colleagues, I am frustrated at the lack of understanding of the need for action on the ground by this institution and its constituent parts in Ukraine. By opening the office, by accompanying your example and visiting the country and being visible within the country, and by taking the lead on war crimes, an issue which we will look at tomorrow. The Head of State Conference that has been called by many needs to be progressed and pursued, and we as the Irish delegation will encourage our government to work with you, President, and to work with the Secretary-General on that as we take up the presidency of the Council of Ministers. We need to re-evaluate what is the purpose of an organisation that was established to stop war, but yet observes one member state invading another. It is time for reflection on why that happened, how that happened, what role did this organisation play in facilitating that to happen, and what role it will play in the new architecture of Europe and of the world in the future. The draft recommendation in Part 5, colleagues, let's reflect on that. It contains a commitment to support and engage with human rights defenders. Let us reflect on Vladimir Kara-Murza today, who came to the Legal and Human Rights Committee in March in Paris and gave evidence and spoke about Russian opposition, spoke about the work of the ground in Russia, of the people that we are reaching out to, citizens of Russia who are defending the Ukraine, who are defending democracy. We need to stand with him in more ways than words. We need to highlight him and feature him as somebody that this Council of Europe, all its bodies, will stand up for, because otherwise other voices of opposition will lose courage and lose heart. Mr. President, we need to act. We need a substantial action to follow up this report as a Council of Europe. Our Prime Minister in Ireland, our Taoiseach, has often said that Ireland, we are militarily neutral, but we are not politically or morally neutral. And this organisation needs to be similar.
Thank you, Dara. Now I call in the debate Mr. Raimond Kaljulaid from Estonia. Raimond, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues. The Russian Foreign Minister, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, made a statement just a few days ago where he called the war in Ukraine a proxy war between the Russian Federation and Western countries and NATO. So let us pause for a moment and let it really sink in that the Foreign Minister of Russia has just announced publicly, officially, that this is indeed a war. And it is a war not between just Russia and Ukraine, it is a war between the West and Russia, NATO and Russia, Europe and Russia. Now, I understand that it's the hope of millions, tens of millions of Europeans today that this war will somehow stop and it will not spill across our borders and bring untold devastation and tragedy to our continent. I'm terribly sorry to say this so bluntly, but it has spilled over our borders. Europe does not stop at the border of the European Union. Ukraine is as much a European country as Germany is, or France. It's just as much a part of Europe as the United Kingdom or Switzerland. Europe is already under attack. This war is not there, it's here. When they're bombing Mariupol and Odessa, port cities, they might as well be bombing Hamburg or Malaga or Marseille or Rotterdam. To end this war, we need to do three things. We need to help Ukraine defend its territory. We have done a lot, we've done more, we need to do more. And we actually have to stop caring what Russia has to say about it. That's not relevant to the case anymore. And I just, sorry to be critical, but I've had listened to some colleagues here stand up and say we need to do more for Ukraine. And then I look up how much they've contributed, and they're not even near the top 10 countries that are contributing to the defense of Ukraine. So talk is cheap. We need to stop sending billions of euros to Russia for energy. We're actually European countries are actually funding the slaughter of Ukrainians, and this needs to stop. And of course, we need to invest more money in our own military capability and defense as well. Now, some point out that cutting Russian energy supplies would mean unbearable economic costs for some European countries. Well, they're nothing compared to what Ukrainians are going through right now. And it's nothing compared to what threatens all of us if we don't stand up to Russia now. I'm sorry my message is so stark, but really, we need to understand that if this war is lost, all is lost. If this war is lost, Europe is lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raymond. Now I call in a debate Madam Jane Stevenson from the United Kingdom. Jane, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We've heard some very fine words this afternoon in the chamber, but sadly, at the moment, fine words simply aren't enough. So while I welcome this report, I echo many voices in this chamber. It does not go far enough. Every day we see more horror from Ukraine. We see evidence of mass graves, we see targeting of civilians, we see women raped in front of their own children. These stories cannot go unpunished, and we must all do all we can to end this conflict as quickly as possible. And all member states have to now send all support. And uncomfortable as it is, this does mean harsh sanctions, and it does mean sending weapons. And before I came here, I spoke to our Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, and she was clear that the UK will continue to stand with Ukraine and provide that military support. And in this report, I'm disappointed that at this extraordinary time, we still maintain that this committee should not make defence recommendations, because in this case, defence, bombs, weapons, this is what is saving Ukrainian lives. This is how our friends in Ukraine can defend themselves. So we cannot take defence as its own island. In this extraordinary moment, we need to come together. We need to send every assistance, and that does mean weaponry. It will cost us. It will cost Europe, but the alternative is far, far worse. To do nothing will cost us infinitely more. We need to stop Putin. We need to do it now. Slava Ukraini. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. La prochaine oratrice dans notre liste est Madame Marie-France Lalonde de la Canada. Marie-France, vous avez la parole.
Contre l'Ukraine il y a 2 mois, plus de 5 millions de réfugiés ont fui vers les pays voisins. Depuis, des informations crédibles ont été recueillies montrant que la Russie a commis des violations du droit humanitaire international et des droits de la personne. La plupart des Ukrainiens se sont rendus en Europe par voie terrestre ou en...
Des bibliothèques ou même un stade qui profite aux populations des quartiers qui ont été là où résidaient les chefs mafieux. En bref, le modèle italien de réutilisation sociale des avoirs confisqués m'a vraiment convaincu. Dans le projet de résolution, j'ai résumé les arguments pour utiliser de cette manière les biens illicites saisis aux criminels, ainsi que les bonnes pratiques en la matière, dont bon nombre sont tirés de l'expérience italienne. Je veux insister sur un point, c'est celui de la nécessité d'avoir une institution centrale chargée d'administrer au niveau national les biens saisis dans un pays, de les administrer depuis le début jusqu'à leur affectation, en attendant leur confiscation et leur allocation ou leur vente définitive. Une telle institution doit en effet disposer de l'expertise technique nécessaire pour optimiser l'utilisation des biens en question, et elle doit faire un rapport régulièrement, comme c'est le cas en Italie, au gouvernement et au Parlement. Je suis heureux de constater que d'autres pays européens, comme l'Espagne, le Royaume-Uni, l'Irlande et mon propre pays, la France, ont aussi commencé à encourager la réutilisation sociale des avoirs illicites confisqués. Je propose donc que nous invitions tous nos gouvernements à faire de même en approuvant la résolution que je vous présente. Je reste bien sûr à votre disposition pour répondre à vos questions et participer à la discussion qui va suivre. Madame la Présidente, j'en ai terminé. Merci.
Vous aurez encore du temps. Très bien. Merci, Monsieur le rapporteur. Nous allons passer à la discussion générale. Je rappelle que la durée d'intervention est limitée à 3 minutes par orateur. Et donc, on commence avec Madame Petra Bayer pour le groupe des Socialistes. Vous avez la parole.
Ja, vielen lieben Dank, Frau Vorsitzende. Organisierte Kriminalität hat im Jahr 2017 etwa 800 Milliarden Umsatz ausgemacht. Da fällt rein Menschenhandel, Drogenhandel, illegaler Handel mit Kunstgegenständen, erzwungene Prostitution, Geldwäsche, Erpressung, Wirtschaftskriminalität, Online-Kriminalität. Und zu dieser organisierten Kriminalität dazu kommt noch Korruption. Korruption als Missbrauch von wirtschaftlicher, politischer und kultureller Macht steht der Realisierung von Menschenrechten diametral entgegen, weil er einfach den Rechtsstaat untergräbt. Und auch da gibt es unterschiedliche Zahlen dazu. Transparency International zum Beispiel schätzt, dass 990 Milliarden Euro im Jahr 2020 weltweit internationale Korruption gekostet hat. Der Internationale Währungsfonds geht sogar von 1,5 Billiarden aus. Das heißt, Korruption und organisierte Kriminalität zusammen machen mehr als 15% des Bruttoglobalprodukts aus in Relation. Aber es ist nicht nur ein finanzieller Schaden, den organisierte Kriminalität und Korruption an der Gesellschaft anrichtet, sie zerstört schlicht und ergreifend auch Leben. Und gleichzeitig ist dann aber auch der Staat in der Pflicht, jene Menschen, die dadurch Schaden erlitten haben, zu entschädigen, denen zu helfen. Und es ist der Staat, der durch Korruption, der durch organisierte Kriminalität, aber auch sehr viel Geld verloren hat, sei es durch Steuerhinterziehung oder sei es durch andere illegale Tätigkeiten, die den Staat geschädigt haben. Ich bin ein großer Fan des Prinzips Let Crime Pay, weil ich glaube, so wie das der Bericht vorschlägt, und dem Bericht ist gar nichts hinzuzufügen, finde ich, ist es wichtig, die Verwendung der Profite wirklich der Allgemeinheit zuzuführen, also die Profite von Verbrechen für die Allgemeinheit auszugeben, weil das auch einerseits das Vertrauen in den Staat stärken kann, zeigt, dass letztendlich Rechtsstaatlichkeit stärker ist als Kriminalität und sie auch besiegt. Es zeigt auch jenen Kräften die rote Karte, jenen politischen Kräften die rote Karte, die die Autorität des Staats bei allen unterschiedlichen Möglichkeiten untergraben wollen. Und ich glaube, es ist auch für Opfer von Kriminalität und von Terrorismus und von Korruption ein wichtiges Zeichen, dass es Solidarität gibt, dass es so etwas wie einen gesellschaftlichen Zusammenhang gibt. Und darum finde ich, dass es sehr vielfältige Effekte von dem Ansatz gibt, den der Berichterstatter verfolgt. Vielen lieben Dank dafür und ich wünsche viel Erfolg bei der Realisierung solcher Vorhaben.
Merci Madame Bayer. La parole est maintenant à Marie-Christine Dallos pour le groupe du PPE. C'est à vous.
Ah, c'est celui-ci. Oui, bien sûr. Merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je voudrais tout d'abord féliciter le rapporteur, Monsieur Vallini, pour son rapport qui atteste d'un travail sérieux et documenté. Et je le remercie. La criminalité organisée et la corruption détournent des circuits légaux des sommes d'argent faramineuses. L'actualité ukrainienne est venue nous rappeler la démesure de ce phénomène. Les fortunes accumulées de manière douteuse par les oligarques russes étaient évaluées par le magazine Forbes à 290 milliards de dollars début mars. L'incidence de telles pratiques n'est pas seulement financière. Les répercussions sont également d'ordre économique, social, sécuritaire, judiciaire, voire même politique. Dans certaines régions, les groupes mafieux sont les premiers pourvoyeurs d'emplois et de logements. La police, la justice, les responsables politiques ne peuvent plus préserver leur indépendance. L'argent sale s'infiltre dans toutes les strates de la société, détruit le lien social existant et finit par constituer une véritable menace pour la démocratie. Ça a du sens ici, au Conseil de l'Europe, d'aborder ce sujet-là, parce qu'il traite aussi de l'avenir de la démocratie. Lutter contre cette hydre nécessite dans un premier temps de tarir la source du système. Mais la seule saisie des avoirs non seulement ne suffit pas, mais peut même s'avérer dangereuse. En effet, confisquer l'argent sale a souvent pour conséquence de déstabiliser l'organisation sociale d'un quartier, voire d'une région. La mafia donnait du travail, des revenus, un logement. Tout cela est remis en cause. Le risque d'un rejet de la part de la population est réel. Si l'on veut surpasser ce choc de l'égalité, susciter l'adhésion des citoyens, il faut redonner aux avoirs confisqués une utilité sociale, réparer le contrat social démocratique détruit par les pratiques criminelles. Pour mettre fin au pouvoir d'attraction du crime organisé, l'État doit entreprendre des actions pédagogiques qui marquent les esprits. Reverser l'argent saisi sur le budget général n'est pas la solution. Il vaut mieux privilégier l'indemnisation directe des victimes, car cette démarche met davantage en évidence la volonté réparatrice de la société. Toutes les initiatives prouvant que l'honnêteté paie doivent être encouragées. Inverser la logique est aussi une excellente façon de saper durablement les bases de l'économie criminelle. Qui n'approuverait pas que l'argent généré par le trafic des stupéfiants soit utilisé pour des programmes de désintoxication? De même, qui pourrait s'opposer à l'utilisation de l'argent du proxénétisme pour aider à la réinsertion des prostituées? C'est ce type d'actions ciblées qui seront les plus efficaces. Le groupe PPE, bien évidemment, votera la résolution et la recommandation proposée. Merci.
Merci, Madame. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Oleksiy Goncharenko pour le groupe CE. C'est à vous, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I want to inform you that Putin answered to our assembly. Just maybe an hour, 2 hours ago, he mentioned Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. This modern Hitler answered to what we are doing here now. He said that, I just want to inform you that he said that Parliamentary Assembly was organized in the beginning of 90s. So, like always, history is not his strong point, to influence on post-Soviet countries. And he said that it's no sense in us anymore. No sense in the Parliamentary Assembly, because he doesn't want any of our advices. And he said that Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe should work on increasing of salaries of people in Europe and in the United States. I don't know why in the United States. But he is a mad person, and he showed it again speaking about our assembly. But first of all, I just want to congratulate us. We did something finally that he should notice. Not just he can go and not notice what we are doing. No, he should notice this. That, I think, is important, that we are now on the right track. I congratulate you. And I want to tell you that this report is extremely important, and extremely important for the whole continent, but for Ukraine especially. Because how will we rebuild our country? Our country is almost completely destroyed. Houses, roads, bridges, airports, infrastructure, hospitals, schools, maternity houses, everything is destroyed by Russian weapons. And it will cost hundreds of billions euros to reconstruct all of this. Who will pay for this? And here is the answer. All these frozen assets of this entourage of Putin, of this close to Putin, and I gave an amendment, I hope it will be supported today, not just Russian oligarchs, because there are no Russian oligarchs. There are wallets of Putin. All of them are nobody. Just imagine, there are extremely severe sanctions against all these Abramovich, Deripaska, and other names. #1 in Forbes in the world. And where is their reaction? They are absolutely silent, because they are nobody. They are just Putin's wallets. So we need to say this money which is frozen, it is hundreds of billions of euros, this is money of Putin himself. And now it is frozen, and it should go to rebuild our country, to rebuild Ukraine, which was destroyed by this criminal, but this killer Putin. And that is very important. It's mentioned in this report. I think that we will strengthen it during the amendments, and I want to thank the rapporteur for this. And we need to do this, because we don't have any other way to have a justice in this question. And one last thing, when we're speaking about Russians, it's not only Russian oligarchs and it's also Russian propagandists. I saw Solovyov villa on the Lake Como, one of their propagandists who is now asking Russia to attack London, New York with nuclear weapons. So such people like Solovyov should lose everything they have, and everything they have should go to Ukrainian refugees and to our state. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à Madame Alexandra Louis pour le groupe ALDE, si elle est en ligne. C'est à vous. Un petit moment, le temps qu'elle se reconnecte. Il faut refaire une demande, Alexandra. Il faut redemander la parole. Il faut changer de navigateur. Il ne faut pas rester sur Safari. Je fais de la technique maintenant, c'est très bien. Donc, si vous avez un problème informatique, vous me demandez, je vais vous dire ça par micro interposé. On va prendre les suivants et on reviendra vers... donc, c'est Monsieur Georges Katrougalos, pardon, pour le GUI. C'est à vous, monsieur.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. This is a very original and innovative report, and I would like to congratulate the rapporteur. You know that throughout our legal systems, usually confiscated criminal assets go either to the national budget or sometimes to the budget of justice. The idea of the social reuse that is adopted by the report, it's very much innovative and educational because first, it contributes to a new legitimation of the judicial system, its visibility. Second, it is very useful to undermine the influence of the organized crime to local societies. The example that the report gives, the villa of a mafioso, which was the center of its power, to be transformed to a center for social use for the local community. But it has some other great ideas that I would like to mention. It's a very good idea, the appeal to make foreign bribery a criminal offense when in the legal system where it is not already, but especially the idea that any fines related to international bribery to be socially reused as it is the case also with confiscated criminal assets. We have here a Greek originality. You know that the Novartis scandal was universal. The American authorities have fined the Novartis Hellas, the Greek branch of Novartis, by $225 million, and we in Greece have done nothing. The Greek authorities have never fined the Greek Novartis, nor the case has reached the courts. Quite on the contrary, the government is now accusing some investigative journalists who made possible the coverage of the scandal. Finally, I find very interesting the ideas of the report on the property of Russian oligarchs. First, the conclusion of the rapporteur that this is money stolen by the Russian people is very, very right. And then also his proposals that this money could be used for rebuilding Ukraine as a kind of condemnation, of compensation, or to the Ukrainian state. Therefore, I think that it is a very good and original report, and my group is going to support it. Many thanks, Monsieur le Rapporteur.
Merci, monsieur. Je repasse la parole à Madame Louis pour le groupe ALDE, si elle est connectée. C'est bon? Non, il y a un problème. Donc, on va continuer. Est-ce que M. Pojcie de Pologne est là pour suivre pour la liste des orateurs? Non plus. M. Ganjaliev pour l'Azerbaïdjan, est-ce qu'il est en ligne? C'est à vous, monsieur.
Chère Madame la Présidente, chers collègues, Mesdames et Messieurs, le crime organisé est l'une des plus grandes menaces pour la sécurité de tout pays et de toute région du monde. Et l'Europe ne fait pas exception. Selon Europol, plus de 5000 groupes criminels organisés font actuellement l'objet d'enquêtes en Europe. Afin de comprendre l'ampleur du problème, nous devons comprendre que le crime organisé est motivé par le profit et que ces activités illégales génèrent une grande quantité de profit pour le groupe criminel impliqué. On estime que le crime organisé au sein de l'Union européenne génère actuellement environ 110 milliards d'euros par an. Cela signifie qu'environ 110 milliards d'euros par an sont volés au public. Dear colleagues, no matter how the illegal assets are acquired, if it is identified, then those who own them should be questioned and the assets should be confiscated. And then the question arises, how to put confiscated criminal assets to good use? This is the important question. I strongly believe that the confiscated assets should be reused and redistributed to those who have suffered because of the accumulation of these assets by criminal ways. At the end of my speech, dear colleagues, I would like to invite my Armenian colleagues to be more constructive and not to misuse the platform provided for them to make unjustified claims against my country. As we have seen in previous sessions and debates, we have to focus more on reconciliation, on confidence-building measures between our nations and between our countries, not vice versa. Merci pour votre attention. Thanks.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à monsieur Collery, pour l'Irlande. C'est à vous.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, in 1996, the Irish journalist Veronica Guerin was murdered by representatives of drug organisations whose work she was highlighting. This was a major shock to our republic, and in her wake, and as a major tribute to her, the Criminal Assets Bureau, CAB, was established. The mission of CAB is to deny and deprive people of the proceeds of criminal conduct. It is a multi-agency body made up of police, of civil servants in revenue, Department of Social Protection, Department of Health, and many departments, brave civil and public servants who put their lives on the line to defend to defend communities, to defend our nation, and to make criminals pay. In 2020, CAB returned €4.2 million to the Irish Exchequer. It froze 935 bank accounts. It also returned money to other governments, money that had been laundered in Ireland that should have been spent and used in their communities. This year, we have established the Community Safety Innovation Fund in Ireland, which will use €2 million to start this year for a range of grants for communities to equip their local communities with community-led responses to assist them in the battle against crime, whether that be local crime, whether that be against drug crime or international crime. And this is the first time that communities will have money to spend working with police, working with law enforcement locally at equipping their community in a bespoke package funded from the proceeds of crime. Madam President, 2 weeks ago, CAB, working with authorities not just in Ireland, but in the United States, in Europe and in the Middle East, arranged for seizure orders on one of the biggest drug gangs in Europe that operated initially out of Ireland. And a major international response that was led from Dublin and pioneered in Dublin has now put one of the biggest drug gangs in the world for the first time on the back foot because of the powers that they have. We will never know the damage that group have done to communities, to families, to futures, but they will now pay for it. They will pay for it with every single cent that they have acquired because of the commitment of our officials in CAB, because the powers that they have in legislation, and now communities that they damaged through community safety innovation will be able to spend money in their communities and rebuild their communities from the damage that was done. I welcome the report, I commend the rapporteur and the chairman, and I welcome the fact that we can now apply the principles of CAD, the principles of seize, tax and recover, and we should, to Russian oligarchs, to people who have lived off the misery of others, lived well, to people who financed governments from that well-living. We must all be honest about that discussion too. Thank you, Madam President.
Merci, monsieur. Alors, on va tenter encore une fois avec Madame Louis, qui, semble-t-il, est désormais connectée. Elle est la porte-parole du groupe ALDE. Alexandra? Non. Bon, bah, écoutez, ce coup-ci, on va continuer avec Madame Julia Kian d'Arménie. Excusez-moi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, one of the tools for combating corruption and organized crime is the confiscation of illicit profits and other criminal assets. But why is it important to fight corruption and kleptocracy? It's crucial, as in my belief, corruption is a national security threat. It undermines democracy, hollows out the rule of law, having an impact on law enforcement bodies and judicial systems, affects the state's effectiveness, affects the economic environment, creating and strengthening a shadow economy, deteriorates the investment climate in the country, and ultimately it can bring to the loss of national sovereignty. Corruption is also fuels the rise of authoritarian leaders who seek to exploit social divisions, who use public office for personal gain, by this undermining democracies worldwide. Corrupt leaders cling to power through patronage networks and exploit rule of law jurisdictions to conceal and protect their stolen assets. These leaders are also accustomed to using strategic corruption as a tool of foreign policy. In my point of view, transparency of assets would enable the world to combat kleptocracy, breaking the pathway still obscure spend. After the Armenian peaceful revolution of 2018, among other reforms in the field of combating corruption, the Armenian government also addressed the mentioned issue. Starting from 2020, the companies operating in Armenia have an obligation to submit a declaration about real owners and beneficiaries. An open register was created for real owners and beneficiaries of legal persons, which makes them transparent for the public. As regards the confiscation of the illicit assets, in 2020, the Armenian parliament adopted a law on confiscation of property of illicit origin, which envisages a non-conviction-based confiscation. It may help not only recover the stolen assets within Armenia and beyond, but also apply the regulations regarding the cases of organized crime, money laundering, trafficking, etc. During the development adoption of this law, the experience of some of the countries of the Council of Europe in the sphere was considered. Based on this law, a special division in the Office of the Prosecutor General was created, and now we can already see the regulations in action. The first cases involving illicit assets of former high-ranking officials have been already sent to the Armenian courts, and we are now expecting the first results of the confiscation process. This means that it's time to think how and for what we are going to use the confiscated illicit assets. From this perspective, the resolution and the respective recommendation on how to put confiscated criminal assets to good use will be extremely important and useful for us. And to conclude, dear colleagues, let me state that it is important to understand how we can join our efforts to combat organized crime, including money laundering, which will in its turn help us strengthen and protect the democratic institutions. We know that the democratic systems are very frequently targeted using the laundered money itself, so it is important to understand what can be done by the democracies to protect themselves and each other. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Je donne la parole maintenant à Madame Juhas pour la Hongrie. C'est à vous.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The topic is highly important. Thank you for the rapporteur. One of the main drivers of criminal activity is the acquisition of profit. It also provides criminals with further resources to continue their illicit activities. in particular within the context of organized criminality, where substantial economic background is essential for the functioning of the criminal network. Ensuring that criminals would not profit of illicit activities is therefore a key issue for the prevention of criminality. It takes away the main motivation for the undertaking of such activities. It is thus fundamental for the disruption of functioning of criminal groups. The impact of confiscating illegal assets on fight against organized crime and corruption is further enhanced by making good use of confiscated financial assets. However, the use of this method should always be cautiously prepared and based on a careful investigation. Such initiatives send us an excellent message about fighting crime and repairing the social damage criminal act cause. Using confiscated assets to help reconstruct and renew parts of our societies most impacted by criminal activities is also a creative and at the same time effective way of remedying the social harm caused by crimes. In this regard, I would like to highlight the important work accomplished by the Committee of Experts on the evaluation of anti-money laundering measures and financing and terrorism. I also would like to stress the importance of the Convention on Laundering, Search, Seizure and Confiscation of the Proceeding from Crime and of the Council of Europe Convention on Laundering, Search, Seizure and Confiscation of the Proceeds Crime and on the functioning of terrorism. Thank you very much indeed.
Merci Madame. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Natalouka pour l'Ukraine.
Hello. Yep. Thank you very much. I would like to thank for this report and for a very good job that the author did in terms of it. And, you know, speaking from the perspective of Ukraine, for us, actually, the using of the confiscated assets is really a topical issue. And especially if you think about Mezhihiria. Mezhihiria was a residence of one of the most corrupted presidents in our history, Viktor Yanukovych, who fled to Russia and is in Russia right now. And basically, it's a territory of 140 hectares, an area that is now used, it has been confiscated from Yanukovych and is now being used as a beautiful park with the mansions that host internally displaced people, veterans of war, children and other people who are undergoing rehabilitation. So for this reason, the issue of assets that have been obtained illegally for us is very important. However, I would like to focus on an issue that was rightly related to the use of property rights, of confiscated property of the citizens of the Russian Federation. As you know, Russia is waging an unprecedented war. I don't need to tell you more about it. Ukraine has already suffered, I think, at least 500,000 billions of dollars, maybe even more than $1 trillion, and it's gonna increase, unfortunately. So today, the property of the famous Russian oligarchs worth billions of dollars has been arrested all over the world, and that includes fancy yachts, mansions, and so on and so forth. And as noted in the report, the main principle of the social reuse is to direct the confiscated assets to the public good, and moreover, to compensate for the harm suffered. However, I would say that the author, of course, rightly assumes that the funds of the Russian oligarchs were stolen to some extent from the ordinary citizens, but does that make them a priority group in this case? No. The corruption system in Russia did not emerge yesterday. I would even dare to say that it began not even under Putin, but just after Russia obtained the status of independent state. And we know that the whole system of Russia is permeated with corruption. And moreover, such state of affairs, allow me to say, is supported by the majority of the Russian citizens, as we see by the polls, and including those war crimes that the Russian army is carrying out in Ukraine today. So, in simple terms, if a mafia boss imposes rent on small criminals and then buys a killer with that money, when this dirty money must be given to the victim of such killer and not returned back to small criminals or small bandits. So for this reason, to understand the part of the wealth of the Russian elites was also a compensation for the aggressive actions of their state. So the Rotenberg, Timchenko, Prigozhin, and many others received contracts from the state of Russia as compensation for sanctions related to the illegal annexation of Crimea. So for this reason, I definitely support this report and ask everybody to endorse it. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à Madame Olaf Lim pour l'Irlande.
Thank you, Madam President. And my colleague has outlined about the Criminal Assets Bureau that we have in Ireland, which has been very successful since it was started in 1996. There's no doubt that organised criminals are motivated by financial gain and that criminal entrepreneurs can generate vast profits. Essentially, these people are enriching themselves at society's expense, particularly when it comes to the area of drugs. And the work of the Bureau is critical in terms of targeting those assets which derive from criminal conduct. And when the Criminal Assets Bureau was set up in 1996, it was pretty much, you could say, a light bulb moment that came from the horrific murders of a crime journalist, Veronica Guerin, and a detective guard, Jerry McCabe. And sometimes we all have that seminal moment when we say enough is enough. We need to be able to put everything in place to try to target this type of horrific behaviour. And when this new law enforcement agency in Ireland was set up, I think one of the key advantages was that it was a multifunctional agency, so it could work right across every department within government, and therefore had a very, very high success rate. And to the extent that right around Europe and right around the world, many of our colleagues and many of our departments of justice have actually come over to learn about how it is put in place. And of course, this Bureau pursues not only the gangsters that are involved in crime and in armed robberies, but also white-collar criminals. And that's also very important. And it is, in a way, I suppose, a type of restorative justice or a type of reparative justice. And while we always need to try to ensure that the criminals pay the price, in terms of trying to support those that are suffering most. And I think that's what's key to what the rapporteur is talking about here. My colleague Deputy Cleary spoke about the Community Safety Innovation Fund, which again is hugely important in relation to continuing on the work. I just want to say that I think the report is absolutely excellent. And we can all learn from the examples in Spain, Italy, Scotland and the UK. And I think I want to really commend the rapporteur in terms of the table that has been put in place in relation to what every country within our union is doing. And there are very good examples for all of us, because while it's important we have the opportunity to say what we feel or to give our country's perspective, it's also important to learn from what other countries are doing. And I think there's a really, really great value in this document in that. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Vardanian pour l'Arménie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Dear colleagues, every lawyer is familiar with the Roman law maxima, ex injuria jus non oritur, which implies that illegal acts do not create law. The report under consideration may be called the same way. We are discussing here a new implications of an ancient legal principle which is still an essential pillar guaranteeing the rule of law and democracy. Here I absolutely agree with the reporter that the illegal assets should be returned to their real owners. Hence, a state shouldn't be the one and only beneficiary of the confiscated illicit assets. Illicitly gained public assets and property should be duly returned to the public. State should be rather a medium for returning public assets to society when to be their end user. For sure, the state should be
and end user in the cases when the confiscated assets were stolen from the state as a result of corruption crime committed by the state official and other associated persons. Here, for sure, I should emphasize that the whole process of confiscation from the very beginning up to its end should be done in full compliance with the principles of the rule of law, democratic standards, as well as with the full respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms. Unfortunately, corruption is still the main source of stealing public benefits from the society. In reality, it is the root of all public evils we face. Corruption transmutes democratic institutions, catalyzing democratic backsliding, creating landromads, disturbing the electoral processes, uprising the organized crimes, usurping the power, and so on. The fight against corruption should be transparent. From the perspective, social reuse of illicit financial assets, and especially property, would be the most visible result of such fight. Implementing social reusing of illegal assets may stimulate civil society institutions, media, and ordinary citizens to be more active in identifying such cases, as well as to make them accessible to the public. Addressing of the issue of combating corruption, it's worth saying that our organization should not be just a spectator of this process. We should be rather the pioneer of this fight. And before shaming and blaming the others, we should not forget that the Council of Europe, and especially our Assembly, should be a success story of fighting corruption all across Europe. We shouldn't also forget that our organization in the recent past also faced unprecedented corruption scandals involving high-ranking officials in different countries. Many of those who engaged in these processes and these scandals were duly punished, but some of them are still continue to benefit from their illicit activities. I strongly believe that our Assembly must have zero tolerance towards any, even smallest case of corruption within our organization, prevented in a very initial phases. The corrupted persons who, by their illicit activities, have undermined the very existence of our Assembly should say farewell to our organization once and for all. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne la parole maintenant à Madame Hernández Ramos pour le Mexique.
Con su permiso, Presidenta. Primero, un mensaje solidario. La pesadilla de la guerra que protagoniza Rusia contra Ucrania es reprobable. Abrazo al pueblo de Ucrania y a su valiente presidente, violentados en sus derechos humanos y en su Estado de Derecho. En México, oramos porque pronto los ucranianos vuelvan a soñar y a tener futuro. La responsabilidad democrática de nuestro tiempo es accionar en favor del diálogo y la paz a nivel global. Entro en materia. Uno de los mejores mensajes disuasivos que los gobiernos pueden enviar en la lucha contra la delincuencia y la corrupción es muy simple: el crimen no paga. Sin embargo, pareciera evidente que si las actividades delictivas no fueran rentables, pues simplemente no ocurrirían. Esta aparente contradicción no es otra cosa que dos momentos distintos en una misma línea del tiempo. En el corto plazo pareciera que la actividad criminal sí es redituable. Los ciudadanos de nuestros países ven que quienes delinquen tienen satisfactores materiales, vehículos, artículos de lujo, joyas o propiedades inmobiliarias a las que un agente común no podría tener acceso a través de su esfuerzo y trabajo lícito. En algunos casos ni siquiera sumando todo lo que ha ganado en su vida. En el largo plazo, las instituciones del Estado encargadas de la procuración y la administración de justicia van lentamente, caso por caso, reduciendo los índices de impunidad criminal a través de condenas que privan de la libertad por muchos años a quienes cometieron los delitos. Sin embargo, la sociedad queda insatisfecha, porque mientras subsistan los bienes adquiridos de forma ilícita, de nada sirve saber que el criminal está tras las rejas, mientras que su familia, sus prestanombres o sobre quienes pesa la sospecha de haber participado en las actividades criminales, continúan disfrutando de esos bienes fruto del delito. En algunos casos incluso es conocido que el criminal cumple su tiempo en prisión y al salir está a su disposición el patrimonio que se construyó ilícitamente. Como parlamentaria mexicana, Tomo nota de las mejores prácticas de forma que podamos ajustar en la medida posible nuestro marco jurídico con la intención de mejorarlo. Es importante considerar que el destino social de los activos recuperados del crimen requiere incorporar a la sociedad civil en el proceso de toma de decisiones y no dejarlo a una determinación unilateral del gobierno. Asimismo, que las autoridades reporten periódicamente al Parlamento sobre el ejercicio de esta atribución y sus consecuencias me parece de especial relevancia, dado que en México, en 2019, realizamos una nueva legislación en esta materia y solo se cuenta con el reporte anual 2019-2020. Finalmente, es de elogiarse que consideren la actualización continua de la legislación y de las prácticas administrativas relacionadas con la recuperación de activos a fin de contrarrestar cualquier estrategia usada por los criminales. En mi país habíamos acordado un informe, una revisión exhaustiva al marco jurídico y ya que no hay emergencia económica ni sanitaria, es algo que debemos retomar. México publicó en su diario oficial la ratificación de la Convención de Nicosia relativa a la recuperación de bienes culturales involucrados. Elogio el proyecto de recomendación que hoy se propone y hago votos porque los parlamentarios mexicanos podamos hacer lo propio en un futuro cercano. Es cuanto.
Merci, madame. La parole est maintenant à madame Tabakou pour l'Albanie, si elle est là. Madame Tabakou? Non. Dans ce cas, je passe la parole à monsieur Uzenov pour l'Azerbaïdjan. C'est à vous.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, every wealth of historical value and moral weight belongs to the people. It's an unwritten law. No matter how much time passes, sooner or later the possession of people will return to its owner. Therefore, is the theft, usurpation, smuggling, and illegal circulation of such wealth is a crime from a legal point of view, then it is also a conspiracy against the people, country, and history from a moral point of view. It is a positive deed to get rid of such wealth from criminals as a result of legal research, then it is doubly noble to take immediate step to use it as the wealth of the people and the country. Using the example of Azerbaijan, I would like to talk about the further successful fate of some of these saved wealth, namely such a fate of most desirable for such wealth. The confiscation of such assets that have fallen into criminal whirlpool is most common case in the customs network. Until 2006, historical and material artifacts usually confiscated were directed to various museums, cultural centers, exhibitions, and research institutes. Although this practice continues today in Azerbaijan. After the foundation of the Customs History Museum in Baku in March 2006, majority of these resources have been concentrated at this address. Today, there are over 200 big and small museums in Azerbaijan. Usually, each museum has its own direction. However, the Museum of the History of Azerbaijani Custom is distinct from all of them. However, the Customs Museum lists items belonging to various areas. Each of the over 600 exhibits is unique. Here are bench paintings, sculptures, and objects of arts and crafts representing the art of Azerbaijan, Western Europe, and the East, as well as coins of ancient Rome, Byzantium, the reign of the Safavids, as well as the copies of the Quran and the Bible of the 19th century. The number of such rare pieces of cultural heritage is so great that several albums associated with them have been published. Of course, each museum object has its own history and biography. However, each of the exhibits of this museum has a history of involvement in criminal trafficking and salvation. Enjoying such gems of art with an adventurous fate, you also think that if these beauties had not been turned out of the jaws of criminals, then they would not have been standing in front of us now. And perhaps no one would have seen them except for a couple of people who had secretly obtained them. But now they still belong to everyone. The famous classic said, "Beauty will save the world." Nevertheless, beauty itself needs always to be saved. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, monsieur. Je donne maintenant la parole à monsieur Ramirez Barba, qui est en ligne et qui est au Mexique.
Señora presidenta, muchas gracias. Felicito al señor André Balini y a la Comisión por la calidad de este reporte que exhibe el impacto del decomiso de activos ilícitos en la lucha contra la delincuencia organizada y la corrupción. Hay que utilizarlos para el bien de la sociedad, ya financiando proyectos destinados a combatir el crimen organizado y confiscar más bienes ilícitos, o bien para reparar los daños causados por los delincuentes a una determinada población. En México, en las últimas décadas, las organizaciones criminales se han fortalecido financieramente, tanto también en la capacidad de corromper a las autoridades en todos niveles, con énfasis incluso en su intervención para imponer autoridades durante las elecciones. Por ello, sus actividades ilícitas como el tráfico de drogas, de personas y la extorsión han crecido hasta llegar a otros países, incluyendo la Unión Europea. La Oficina de Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Delito, en su informe 2021, alertó que los tentáculos de los cárteles mexicanos han ampliado ya su presencia en Europa, aprovechando el auge de las metanfetaminas, el fentanilo y otras drogas sintéticas a raíz del incremento de la demanda durante la pandemia COVID-19. En España y Eslovaquia se han incautado grandes cantidades de metanfetamina que se cree provenían de México. El presidente López Obrador presentó como insignia de su gobierno la lucha contra la corrupción. Sin embargo, desde su toma de protesta, decidió dejar de combatir la delincuencia organizada, apostando por la omisión de la autoridad con una política institucional llamada por él mismo abrazos y no balazos. En junio del 2020, declaró el presidente mexicano: yo ordené que se detuviera ese operativo y se dejara en libertad a ese presunto delincuente, el hijo del Chapo Guzmán. Luego, en otra gira, saludó a la mamá del antecitado narcotraficante. La Junta Internacional de Estupefacientes reportó en el 2021 que los cárteles mexicanos operan unos 25,000 millones de dólares al año tan solo por operaciones dentro de México. Y el reporte internacional sobre la estrategia de control de drogas del 2022 manifiesta la capacidad limitada de nuestro gobierno para procesar los delitos de lavado de dinero. Hay apenas 9 condenas por lavado de dinero entre el 18, 19 en el 19 y solo 13 en el 2020. Se creó el Instituto para devolver al pueblo lo robado, habiéndole transferido la Fiscalía General de la República en los casi 4 años ya de gobierno apenas 106 millones de dólares y distribuyó, según el tercer informe de gobierno, apenas 11 millones de dólares en ayudas sociales y apoyos para crear infraestructura. Me comprometo como legislador a hacer del conocimiento del gobierno y del Congreso mexicano los ejemplos de buenas prácticas señaladas en el presente reporte del señor Balini de Italia, España, Reino Unido y Francia. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Merci à vous. Et enfin, je termine la liste des orateurs avec Madame Kratchouk d'Ukraine.
Thank you, dear colleagues, for the ability to deliver my message. Madam President, Honourable Rapporteur, colleagues, when we speak about these dirty criminal assets, especially those owned by Russian oligarchs, and their good use, we need to understand the following thing. The assets of oligarchs and those that are associated with Kremlin are essentially assets used by Putin and his surrounding. Entirely Russian economy is based on the use of economic assets that nominally belong to individuals and legal entities, but they serve basically as financial pockets of the Russian regime. So they cannot be dissociated from the regime while they are the source of, for funding the aggressive war against Ukraine. So I call the rapporteur and PACE in general to investigate in further reports what kind of action could be made with regard to blocking and confiscating of such assets and eventually their use for reparations and compensations to Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Ukrainian government currently estimates the damage to the national economy at least $600 billion. In particular, only to restore the infrastructure of and the whole city of Mariupol will be needed $10 billion. As of late April, almost 2,000 of residential buildings were destroyed in the city of Kharkiv. More than 205 hospitals, 586 schools, 319 kindergartens, and hundreds of other important infrastructure facilities have been destroyed or damaged overall territory of Ukraine. Besides of the money, particular houses and apartments could be used for receptions of Ukrainians who fled the war. It would be fair to attract more assets of Russian oligarchs to cover these losses and expenses, not just taxpayers from the European countries. Thank you so much.
Merci. Donc, la liste des oratrices et des orateurs est maintenant épuisée. J'appelle la réplique de la Commission. Monsieur le rapporteur, vous avez 3 minutes pour répondre aux intervenants.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Oui, quelques mots d'abord pour partager ce qui a été dit par de nombreux orateurs sur la pédagogie de la réutilisation sociale des avoirs criminels confisqués. Le crime ne paie pas, ça a été dit à plusieurs reprises. Il faut montrer que non seulement le crime ne paie pas, mais qu'en plus, grâce à la réutilisation sociale de l'argent du crime, on peut redonner confiance au peuple dans la démocratie et dans l'état de droit. Le deuxième point, Madame Dalloz a parlé du choc de l'égalité. Elle a eu bien raison et cela m'a fait souvenir de ce qu'on m'a expliqué en Italie, à savoir qu'il faut être très vigilant sur les entreprises. On parle des villas, des bateaux, des yachts, des voitures de luxe et des appartements, mais il y a aussi des entreprises qui fonctionnent de façon totalement clandestine, entre guillemets, et on s'aperçoit trop souvent que lorsqu'une entreprise rentre dans la légalité, après que le chef mafieux ait été emprisonné, cette entreprise se casse la figure, si vous me passez l'expression, parce qu'elle doit acquitter des impôts et acquitter des cotisations sociales. Donc c'est à l'État de veiller à ce choc de l'égalité pour que les entreprises ne disparaissent pas, ce qui crée du chômage et ce qui risque, et c'est arrivé notamment dans la région de Rome, ce qui risque de faire en sorte que la population soit en colère contre l'État qui a mis un terme au fonctionnement mafieux de cette entreprise parce que les gens se retrouvent au chômage alors qu'ils avaient du travail avec la mafia. Enfin, un troisième point, je me réjouis bien sûr de l'accueil qu'ont réservé nos collègues ukrainiens à mes propositions sur la confiscation, bien sûr, mais la réutilisation des avoirs criminels des oligarques russes en faveur du peuple ukrainien, en faveur des réfugiés ukrainiens et en faveur de la reconstruction de l'Ukraine. Je vous remercie.
Monsieur le Président de la Commission, Monsieur Cottier.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Au nom de la Commission, en effet, j'aimerais rappeler que l'excellent rapport de notre collègue, le sénateur Vallini, s'inscrit dans une série de rapports précédents que notre Commission a présentés avec l'objectif commun de combattre le crime organisé et la grande corruption en l'attaquant là où cela fait mal, à savoir au portefeuille. Le premier rapport de cette série était celui du sénateur Mart van den Ven, notre ancien collègue, qui rappelait le modèle irlandais et qui proposait la confiscation des avoirs criminels sans condamnation pénale, donc en fait le renversement de la charge de la preuve. Et plusieurs pays membres ont introduit par la suite des mesures législatives qui étaient inspirées de ces recommandations. Ensuite, il y a eu le rapport de notre collègue ici présente, Suna Evasdottir, qui a soumis des propositions concrètes pour renforcer les cellules de renseignement financier, augmenter les capacités des autorités de détecter et de geler les avoirs illicites en temps utile. Selon le rapport de la Banque mondiale, cela a été dit, les bénéfices, si je peux m'exprimer ainsi, les bénéfices annuels du crime organisé de la grande corruption s'élèvent à plus de 2 000 milliards de dollars et dont une bonne partie sur le continent européen. Voilà de quoi résoudre de nombreux problèmes sociaux sur notre continent. Et c'est cette dernière question qui est traitée par le rapport du sénateur Vallini. Quel bon usage pouvons-nous faire des avoirs qui sont confisqués? Comme vous avez pu le constater, ce rapport, et cela a été dit par plusieurs intervenants, est également inspiré par des bonnes pratiques qui existent dans plusieurs pays qui ont été cités, notamment en particulier celui de l'Italie où le sénateur s'est rendu. Et des fois, dans nos activités politiques, on nous dit dans la population qu'il n'y a pas des impacts assez concrets des mesures que nous prenons, mais l'exemple qui a été donné, qui a été pris par plusieurs de la villa du mafieux, qui est réutilisé pour la collectivité, alors là, il y a vraiment quelque chose de très concret et d'extrêmement visible. Il y a aussi un aspect qui a moins été évoqué aujourd'hui, qui est la restitution des avoirs au plan international. Et là, je viens d'un pays, la Suisse, qui a aussi développé des bonnes pratiques dans ce domaine. Il y a aussi la possibilité, en collaboration entre les deux États, celui qui restitue l'argent et celui qui le reprend, d'attribuer ces montants à la collectivité. Et il y a des exemples qui ont été développés, en particulier à travers des mécanismes de la Banque mondiale, qui sont aussi des aspects intéressants. Puis ce rapport a été enrichi, cela a été dit, cela a été souligné par plusieurs, de la question du traitement des avoirs qui sont confisqués de citoyens et d'entreprises russes en lien avec le conflit en Ukraine. Et là, M. Vallini a proposé des éléments qui sont immédiats et qui sont vraiment dans l'actualité et importants de la situation que nous vivons. Je me réjouis de l'accueil qui a été fait à ce rapport et que les exemples qui sont cités aillent aussi loin que le Mexique, où notre collègue a dit tout à l'heure qu'il allait essayer de faire essaimer ces bonnes idées. Le rapport a le soutien plein et entier de notre commission. Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Merci à vous. La discussion générale est désormais close. La Commission des questions juridiques et des droits de l'homme a présenté un projet de résolution sur lequel 4 amendements et un sous-amendement ont été déposés et un projet de recommandation sur lequel aucun amendement n'a été déposé. J'ai été informée par le président de la Commission des questions juridiques et des droits de l'homme que les amendements 3 et 4 sur le projet de résolution ont été adoptés à l'unanimité par la Commission. Est-ce bien le cas, Monsieur le Président? C'est exact. Y a-t-il une objection à ce que nous les considérions comme adoptés par l'Assemblée? S'il y en a une, veuillez vous manifester, les présents levant la main, ceux participant à distance en demandant la parole. Il n'y a pas d'objection, donc les amendements 3 et 4 sur le projet de résolution sont déclarés adoptés définitivement. Nous commençons par le projet de résolution. L'amendement numéro 1 fait l'objet d'un sous-amendement de la Commission des questions juridiques et des droits de l'homme. La parole est à Monsieur Alexei Goncharenko pour soutenir l'amendement numéro 1. Monsieur Goncharenko, vous avez 1 minute.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. This amendment is about changing the wording for more precise and more juridical one. Because speaking about Russian oligarchs, who is oligarch? What does it mean? Where is the definition? So, and also already I said that the Russian oligarchs, they do not exist in reality. These all are just pockets, wallets of Putin, bigger and smaller or very big, but nothing more. So the proposition is to change it. First, my proposition was to change it Russian citizens and oligarchs, to add citizens, but the proposition of rapporteur to say just citizens, which is absolutely logical, and I think that is important because we're speaking about oligarchs who are wallets of Putin, about people who work for the state, like they say, but in reality, they're absolutely corrupted and just also working for Putin, about propagandists and others who are guilty in what had happened. Thank you.
Bien, nous en venons au sous-amendement numéro 1. La parole est à Monsieur le Président Damien Cottier pour le soutenir au nom de la Commission des questions juridiques et des droits de l'homme.
Oui, merci Madame la Présidente. Comme l'a dit Monsieur Goncharenko, en fait, lui ajoutait citoyen, ça devenait citoyen et oligarque, et comme les oligarques sont en général des citoyens, et que à l'amendement 3, nous avons ajouté les entreprises, en fait, on peut supprimer le terme oligarque, il reste citoyen et entreprise, et ça couvre l'ensemble des cas, et l'auteur de l'amendement avait dit en commission, et je crois qu'il peut le dire ici, je crois qu'il vient de le dire ici, qu'il est également d'accord avec ce sous-amendement.
D'accord, donc on part du principe que l'auteur est d'accord. Est-ce que quelqu'un demande la parole contre ce sous-amendement? Non, donc la Commission est favorable à ce sous-amendement, l'auteur également. Nous allons procéder au vote sur le sous-amendement. Le scrutin est ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage. Le sous-amendement a été adopté à l'unanimité. Nous allons maintenant procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 1 ainsi sous-amendé. Alors d'abord, est-ce qu'il y a... avant cela, nous allons d'abord voir si quelqu'un est contre l'amendement numéro 1, ainsi sous-amendé. Non. L'avis de la Commission?
Il est favorable.
Très bien. Nous allons procéder au vote de l'amendement ainsi sous-amendé. Le scrutin est ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage. L'amendement 1, ainsi sous-amendé, a été adopté à l'unanimité. Donc, l'amendement numéro 3 avait déjà été adopté à l'unanimité, l'amendement numéro 4 également. On passe à l'amendement numéro 2. La parole est à M. Oleksiy Goncharenko pour soutenir l'amendement numéro 2. C'est à vous.
Yeah, and this amendment is extremely important, and I do ask all of you to support it, because it's saying that now it is the original wording, that this money, these assets were stolen from the Russian people and should be returned to them. But sorry, and what about paying for what is done by Putin, by Russian army? And again, Russian people, how to give back it to them? Through Putin? Or we have another ways to do it? We have only Russian public service, which is absolutely controlled by dictator Putin. So I really ask you, that is extremely important, because it's a question, really, who will pay for all this rebuildment? Taxpayers of the United States, of France, Germany, other countries, or those who did it, or those who committed it? So I ask you to support the amendment which is saying the frozen assets should go at the first place to rebuild Ukraine and to compensate to the victims of awful atrocities that had happened. And I ask you to support it. That's very important for us. Thank you.
Merci. Quelqu'un demande-t-il la parole contre l'amendement? Monsieur le rapporteur.
Oui, Madame la Présidente. En fait, nous avons le même objectif que M. Goncharenko, mais nous le formulons d'une autre façon qui nous semble plus simple juridiquement et plus claire. Donc, je suis défavorable à cet amendement.
Quel est l'avis de la Commission?
Elle est opposée à cet amendement, Madame la Présidente.
Très bien, donc avis défavorable, mais nous allons procéder au vote sur l'amendement numéro 2. Le scrutin est ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage des résultats. L'amendement numéro 2 n'a pas été adopté. Il a été rejeté. Donc, on fait maintenant un vote sur le projet de résolution. La majorité simple est requise. Le scrutin est ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos. Je demande l'affichage des résultats. Le projet de résolution a été adopté à l'unanimité. Nous allons passer au projet de recommandation sur lequel aucun amendement n'a été déposé. Donc, je vous rappelle que la majorité requise est celle des 2/3 des suffrages exprimés pour le projet de recommandation. Le scrutin est ouvert dans l'hémicycle et à distance. Le scrutin est clos et je demande l'affichage du résultat. Le projet de recommandation contenu dans le document 15 500 a été adopté à l'unanimité. Bravo au rapporteur pour son rapport. Je vais laisser la présidence à ma collègue, le temps effectivement que le rapporteur du prochain dossier arrive.
Thank you. And the next item of business this afternoon is the debate on the report titled Fighting and Preventing Excessive and Justified Use of Force by Law Enforcement Officers. And this is document 15498, presented by Mr. Alexander Mereshenko on behalf of the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights. And the rapporteur might not be online. No, not. So we are happy with the chair of the committee. In order to finish by 8:30 p.m., I will interrupt the list of speakers at about 8:15 p.m. to allow time for the reply and the vote. And I will call Mr. Mereshenko, rapporteur. You have 7 minutes to present the report, and then we'll have a further 3 minutes to reply to the debate at the end. But the chair of the committee will take the floor instead, since we are not online at the moment. So the floor is yours, Chair.
Thank you, Mrs. President. Yes, Mr. Mereshko is in Ukraine and is not in the possibility to connect at the moment. Unfortunately, he was until a few minutes ago. Until a few minutes ago, we were in contact with him, but apparently we cannot connect. If he is connected, I will let him the floor. But if it's not the case, I will make the presentation of his report. It's a pity because it's a lot of work and an important work that Mr. Mereshko has been doing. Whether in war or in times of peace, violence brings nothing but destruction and human suffering. Violence begets violence. This quote precedes Mr. Mereshko's report, which is before you for adoption today. Mr. Mereshko's report is based on a simple idea. The member states of the Council of Europe should eventually adopt a specific binding international legal instrument to fight and to prevent the use of excessive force by police and law enforcement officers. To reach this goal, the report proposes several measures. As you may see from the content of the report, a well-known incident of excessive use of force in the United States of America triggered the idea of proposing a binding international instrument, the death of George Floyd, which became widely known in Europe and worldwide, thanks to the movement Black Lives Matter. Yet, during the research, Mr. Mereshko found many other incidents of excessive force by law enforcement agents, including in European countries. What struck him the most was that using force seems to become the accepted normality in some states to suppress peaceful protest or to protect borders against the influx of migrants. In some countries, excessive force became a systemic problem, where law enforcement agents themselves contributed to the escalation of violence. The report mentions some of these examples: the March 1st events in Armenia, the 7 April events in Moldova, the Euromaidan in Ukraine, the Yellow Vests, the Gilets jaunes protests in France, the England riots in the UK, clashes with protesters against COVID-19 restrictions in other states. Russia and Belarus merit a special mention in this regard. Mr. Mereshko's research showed a systemic suppression of opposition and peaceful protest using excessive force. Now we witness the consequences of such systemic actions, which proved to be disastrous not only for Russian and Belarusian societies, but also for neighboring countries. To prevent excessive use of force by law enforcement officers, the report by Mr. Mereshko proposes a range of measures to be taken by member states and also by the Committee of Ministers. In the report, there is a compilation of the relevant international legal standards of the Council of Europe, but also of the United Nations. Most of them are non-binding and need further implementation in practice. For example, the Court's case law, the CPT standards, the Committee of Ministers' recommendation define clear principles and legal standards for police on how to use force lawfully and with a legitimate purpose. These principles would benefit from being compiled in one document, an up-to-date recommendation of the Committee of Ministers. This could be the first step towards a special Council of Europe Convention on the prevention of excessive police violence, completed with a strong follow-up mechanism. The draft resolution also proposes that member states review the compatibility of their domestic legislation and their practices in accordance with these international principles. Independent mechanisms within or outside police institutions should be established to prompt efficient and independent investigation into the causes of excessive use of force to ensure accountability of those involved. States should continue improving the efficiency of their judicial and prosecutorial system, including by providing adequate and dissuasive sanctions. In parallel, the Council of Europe should provide support to member states by collecting and disseminating good policy practices while handling mass events. And effective protection should be guaranteed to whistleblowers. National anti-torture mechanisms and other relevant national human rights institutions must have the competence to monitor the use of force by law enforcement officers, and national parliaments must strengthen parliamentary oversight over the activities of law enforcement agencies. Last but not least, states must give priority to the execution of the court's judgment relating to the excessive or unjustified use of force. The draft recommendation proposes that the Committee of Ministers adopt a specific recommendation which will include all these and other relevant measures. Following the adoption of a recommendation, the Committee of Ministers should launch the drafting process for a new convention. To conclude, it can be challenging for law enforcement officers to respond to violent action, and most of them do their work without using force in an excessive method, and I must underline here that they have a difficult work to do. But in some cases, there are problems, and force must always be used in a lawful manner and in full compliance with human rights. Thank you, Mrs. Chairwoman.
Thank you, Chair Damon Cottier. And I am informed that we have also the rapporteur together online. And normally we will have 3 minutes for the rapporteur in the end of the debate. And I think it's time to be a little bit generous to give him 1-2 more minutes in the end of the debate. So, Mr. Rapporteur Marchenko, you will have the floor in the end of the debate. Thank you, Chair. Then we continue on the speakers on the behalf of the political groups. And the first is the speaker, Mr. Emanuel Singieres from the EPP in Lithuania. I do not see him in the
point of order,
plenary.
Mrs. President, sorry,
Yeah,
point of
Chair.
order. I'm not sure that Mr. Mareshko will still be available at the end of the debate. Could you give him the 3 minutes now, actually? Would be very
You are
generous
informed
of
that
you.
he's not, he will not be in the end?
I misunderstood you. Is he online?
He is connected, yes, yes. He's connected, so we have contact with him, and he's informed that we will be generous in the end of the debate.
That's not the information we had, but in this case,
We have.
Thank you,
We try to have the overview. So, but.
Thank you.
Oh, he's asking to speak now. Excellent. Then we give the floor, and then you have 3 minutes, Mr. Rapporteur Marchenko. Thank you. The floor is yours. There you are.
Colleagues, dear friends, I hope you can hear me. Yes?
We hear you. Yes.
Great. There are some technical problems. And first of all, I would like to thank those who stayed so late. And to me, it's important. I'll try to explain in simple words what I mean and what was the basic concept behind this report and the resolution. So there is a problem, a serious social problem, which we call police brutality or excessive, unjustified use of force by law enforcement officers. And we need to find solution, legal solution to this problem. And my report is trying to answer this issue and to find this solution by means of creating special international treaty, regulating international relations and creating uniform, legally binding rules regulating use of force by police enforcement officers. We know that there are soft law rules, different kinds of codes, different kinds of legal documents, which are not legally binding. And the issue is how to codify them and how to create uniform rules, which would be legally binding, which would be hard law, not soft law. So this is my ambition, to try to offer at least, to try to codify such rules and to make them legally binding by concluding international treaty. I view this endeavor or this ambition as trying not only to protect the potential victims of the police brutality or excessive use of force and justified use of force, but also by creating legal certainties themselves. Because by knowing these rules, they will be trying to behave within limits, certain legal limits, which is also important for them. I also would like to stress that one of the challenges for this report is that we have different cultures, different legal cultures and different societies. And in these societies, there can be different norms regarding use of force by police. So this is the biggest challenge, but that's why we need to create this mechanism and to finally draft an international treaty, an international convention under the aegis of the Council of Europe. So whether I failed or succeeded, I don't know. It's up to you to judge. Thank you, dear friends.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mereshko. It was good to both listen and have contact with you. And then we continue with the speakers on behalf of the political groups. And the first speaker is Mr. Singieris from the EPP group, Lithuania. I do not see him in the plenary. Is he online? No. Then we continue with the European Conservatives, Norbert Klein-Wächter from Germany. The floor is yours.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le rapporteur, votre rapport attire notre attention à un grave problème qui existe en Europe. En Allemagne, en France, en Autriche, en Hollande et dans d'autres pays d'Europe centrale et orientale, le comportement des forces de l'ordre lors d'interventions viole des droits de l'homme. Il y a de nombreux cas d'usage disproportionné de la force contre les manifestants pacifiques, consistant notamment à frapper les manifestants ou à utiliser des techniques d'encerclement des foules qui peuvent menacer leur sécurité. Au lieu de la mort de George Floyd, il y avait plus près de nous assez de situations malheureuses pour servir de raison à ce rapport. La crise des Gilets jaunes en France en est un bon exemple. Cette crise avait en effet été le lieu de violences inouïes. Tout le monde se souvient de ces visages tuméfiés des manifestants. Le summum serait atteint avec la crise du Covid-19. De nombreuses manifestations pour dénoncer les mesures anti-Covid liberticides avaient été violemment réprimées, restreignant ainsi considérablement la liberté d'expression. Je cite Amnesty International qui a noté non seulement les manifestants ont été exposés à un usage excessif de la force lors d'opérations de maintien de l'ordre, mais les autorités ont aussi instrumentalisé les lois contraires au droit international pour verbaliser, arrêter arbitrairement et poursuivre en justice des personnes n'ayant commis aucune violence. Grave atteinte aux droits de l'homme provoquée par le gouvernement d'Emmanuel Macron. En ce qui concerne l'Allemagne, le rapporteur spécial pour la torture des Nations Unies Nils Melzer relate de nombreux cas de violence disproportionnée de la police et dénonce une défaillance complète du système de contrôle et de surveillance des polices. Aucune mesure disciplinaire n'a été prise contre les policiers fautifs. Dans certains Länder, il n'existe même pas de statistiques sur les actes de violence policière. En plus, sous le prétexte de protection de la santé publique, les gouvernements ont donné aux policiers l'ordre de réprimer toute manifestation. Profitant donc de l'état d'urgence sanitaire, les policiers avaient les coudées franches, avec la couverture de leurs supérieurs hiérarchiques, bien entendu. Les autorités, outre le fait de couvrir ces comportements des policiers, leur garantissent également protection et impunité. En Allemagne, des manifestants ont été condamnés à l'issue de procédures de référé. Plusieurs plaintes en justice déposées contre les policiers ont été cependant classées sans suite sur intervention des autorités. Non seulement les autorités couvrent les actes de violence policière, elles profitent aussi de la complicité d'autres organisations. La Deutsches Institut für Menschenrechte, par exemple, ne fait aucune mention de la violence policière dans son rapport de 2020. Or, nous sommes certains qu'il y a eu des actes de violence policière contre les manifestations anti-mesures Corona au cours de cette année. Il y a donc beaucoup de travail qui nous reste à faire et je salue ce rapport et les solutions proposées. Merci.
Vielen Dank, Herr Kleinwächter. The next speaker on my list is the representative and the speaker on behalf of ALDE, and Ingvild Wetterhus Thorsvik from Norway. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to start by giving praise to the rapporteur for an excellent report on a very important subject. It's been almost 2 years since George Floyd was killed by the police in the US. It sparked an international anti-racist protest led by people fighting for fundamental justice and against racism and discrimination. The police depend on trust of citizens to do their job, which is securing a safe society. Citizens must be able to be completely confident that the rule of law and their human rights are safeguarded if police, as a representative of the state, exercise power against them. Examples of excessive force can lead to tension and distrust in society and injustice against individuals. We must not forget that the main rule is that the state cannot exercise power over its citizens. Coercive measures represent an exception to these principles, as these are major infringements on our personal freedoms. Therefore, strict and clear conditions must be met for the use of force, and they must be compatible with fundamental principles like legality, necessity, and proportionality, and not least non-discrimination. Without these principles, use of force is a breach of human rights. It is imperative to work for increased trust in the police amongst citizens, especially amongst minorities. Everyone should be able to be themselves and live the life that they want, as long as it does not infringe upon someone else's freedom. It is the duty of the majority to ensure that minorities are well taken care of and are allowed to live freely, regardless of ethnic, cultural, religious background, sexual orientation, or gender presentation. Many people with minority backgrounds have less trust in the police being there to help than the majority has. This must be changed. I do believe it's very important for the Council of Europe to adopt the recommendation, working towards making sure national laws criminalize excessive use of force by government officials, which is imperative to prevent it happening. The Council of Europe states should promote and respect their law enforcement rules in line with their national constitutions and respect for human rights. Any incident of disproportionate or illegal use of force should be systematically subject to an investigation from independent mechanisms, and officers or agencies should be held accountable in cases of excessive use of force. Excessive and wrongful use of force cannot be tolerated, and it needs an urgent response. We need to work together on this to make sure that the communities are able to trust that law enforcement officers and to hinder injustice against individuals.
Thank you, Mrs. Thorsvik. And the next speaker is on behalf of the United Left. It's Feliknas Yuka from Turkey. The floor is yours.
Vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin, verehrte Kollegen. Ich möchte mich bei dem Berichterstatter für den wichtigen Bericht bedanken. Nach dem Tod von George Floyd in den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika löst dieser eine Welle von Protesten gegen die Straffreiheit. Natürlich ist die Polizeigewalt nicht nur ein Problem in den Vereinigten Staaten, sondern wir erleben es auch in Europa, wo die Gewalt auch auf friedlichen Kundgebungen oder Protestaktionen verübt wird. Auch hier sehen wir auf friedliche Kundgebungen oder Protestaktionen, dass polizeiliche Übergriffe beleidigend, erniedrigender und willkürlicher Praktiken rapide zunehmen. Selbst diese Gewalt wird als Straffreiheit für Beamte ausgesprochen. Und das führt dazu, dass die Gewalt zumindest zunimmt. In letzter Zeit erleben wir sogar, dass sich in den Polizeistrukturen massive rechtsradikale Gruppierungen wiederfinden. Und das ist sehr gefährlich. Der Ausmaß der Gewalt gegen Einwanderer an den Grenzen nimmt von Tag zu Tag zu. In vielen Ländern verüben Grenzpolizisten Gewalt gegen Einwanderer, die versuchen, die Grenzen zu überschreiten. Diese Gewalt bleibt immer wieder straffrei. Auch politische Gefangene sind in den Gefängnissen sowohl physisch als auch psychischer Folter ausgesetzt, in denen ihnen willkürliche Behandlungen, insbesondere das Recht auf Leben, genommen wird. Dies führt dazu, dass sich die Menschen das Leben nehmen. Sehr oft wird den Menschen das Verfassungsrecht oder Demonstrationsrecht genommen. Oder sie werden daran gehindert, eine kritische Stellungnahme oder Erklärung gegen die Regierung auszuüben und sind dann der Polizeigewalt ausgesetzt. Zum Beispiel sollte beim Referendum 2017 in Katalonien gegen die Brutalität der Polizei eine Untersuchung eingeleitet werden, welche jedoch bis heute nicht aufgeklärt wurde. Ich möchte auch auf die Polizeigewalt in die Türkei eingehen. Allein Mitglied der Opposition zu sein, eine Frau zu sein oder ein Kurde zu sein, ist Grund genug, Rechtsverletzungen oder Polizeigewalt zu erfahren. So auch bei einer Demonstration, einer Pressekonferenz oder einer friedlichen Aktion, welche mit Polizeigewalt und Tränengas endet. In den kurdischen Provinzen sind in den letzten 14 Jahren mindestens 41 Menschen durch gepanzerte Fahrzeuge der Polizei auf den Straßen ums Leben gekommen, darunter 20 Kinder. Und immer wieder kommt es hier bei solchen Vorfällen zu Straflosigkeit der Beamten und die Ermittlungen gegen die Polizisten werden eingestellt. Selbst wir als Abgeordnete werden angegriffen und an unserer politischen Arbeit gehindert. Wenn schon so mit uns umgegangen wird, dann stellen wir uns doch einfache Bürger vor, was mit ihnen passiert oder wie mit ihnen umgegangen wird. In allen Ländern, wo die Bürger gefoltert und misshandelt worden sind, laufen Dutzende Gerichtsverfahren. Wir wissen auch, dass durch die Polizeigewalt und Misshandlungen die Gesetze nicht wirksam durchgesetzt werden, aufgrund von der ineffektiven Umsetzung der Gesetze und der Nichteinhaltung internationaler Konventionen. Die Bekämpfung von Gewalt und Polizeibrutalität liegt in der Hauptverantwortung aller. Dankeschön.
Thank you, Mrs. Uka. And the next speaker on behalf of the Socialist Group, Thorhildur Sunna Abasdottir from Iceland. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to start by thanking the rapporteur for his excellent report and for our excellent collaboration in the preparation for the report. The police is one of the few institutions in our member states that are permitted and legally allowed to use force against their citizens. But with great power comes great responsibility. And it is therefore that this report is so important, because it stresses the fact that we need to hold the police accountable for excessive use of force, that we need to end impunity for police violence that is unjustified and unjust. Now, the rapporteur points out very serious and very comprehensive and important actions that we can take to strengthen our police, to strengthen the protection of our citizens from police violence. One of these are independent oversight. It is vitally important that the police is subjected to independent oversight mechanisms, ones that do not have any direct connection with the police officers being investigated, so that the public can have trust in the police and in the investigation of police violence, but also so that the police is subject with a fair assessment of their actions. And therewith we also work against impunity that has often been the case when it comes to police violence. Another very important aspect is the fight against racism in the police. I've noted, for instance, in my own home country, that the police doesn't want to admit that there's any kind of racism amongst their ranks. But of course, like in any institution, of course there is racism, and we must fight against racism and racism-informed policing and excessive use of force based on race. So there should be awareness training, awareness raising when it comes to racism in the police. And of course, just general, like it is very clearly pointed out in this report, general training based on human rights, on the citizens' right to protest, on the right to assembly, which is very important. I think also that we need to focus on this new treaty that the rapporteur is suggesting. I think once we have gathered all of these best practices that we really do want our police forces to internalize, and we have found a comprehensive way of putting them together, we should make a new treaty. We should safeguard the role of the police. And the role of the police should be to be servants of the people, not silencers of the people. Let us find a common ground to make this a reality that we can all count on in the Council of Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Evasdotter. And then we continue on the speakers list, and the next speaker is Mrs. Katja Dekanowitze from Georgia, and on behalf of the EPP group. I do not think she's here. Then we continue with Assem Moladze from the European Conservatives from Azerbaijan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. First of all, I'd like to congratulate our reporters for a very important report, because the world is changing really very fast. Now, in Europe, in the center of Europe, we were witnesses that even some public events becoming different. COVID, social situation. Now changing even all form of protests. Sometimes just regular citizens go to street, and thanks to TV, thanks that the world and new technology help us to see that old people was beaten by police violently in the center of Europe, in Netherlands, in Paris. Journalists was beaten severely because he had black skin. Many times we see that use of excessive force, sometimes accompanying traditional maybe form of racism. They beating maybe with more emotions, poor guys, migrants, because they have a different color of skin, speaking a little bit with accent, and look like a Muslim. And I think that this situation based on serious problems in society. On the other hand, we have to think about the rights of police and rule of law, because we're talking about injustice using force from police, but in different cases, for example, Black Lives Matter events in the United States, continuing in form of looting, attack to people, and police should protect shops, banks, ordinary citizens, and police train for use of force. I think that a very important time now to have concrete protocol. What is the framework of activity of police? In one hand, he has an order from politicians, because politicians gave them an order to act. On the other hand, how he should do. I think that we should work on this type of thing, and there should be a concrete protocol of actions of police when he is trying to keep stability in the country from sometimes different very dangerous forces. I would like to remind you famous expression. It's famous in Europe because Molotov created this cocktail with the goal to destabilize situation in Western world. Is we continuing this way? That's why I think we should be very carefully on all definition, and there should be a framework for all these acts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Molazza. The next speaker should be online. It's Madame Martine Vonner from France and representing ALDE. No, she's not online. Then I think we continue with the representative from Turkey, Mr. Ziya Altuniadis. No, she's online. Sorry. We have 1 minute, 2 minutes. We try to get contact with Madame Martine Vonner, France. ALDE.
Oui, merci. Merci, Madame la Présidente, chers collègues. Ces dernières années, il est constaté un renforcement manifeste de l'usage de la force par les pays membres du Conseil de l'Europe. Cet usage est inquiétant en ce qu'il est appliqué de manière croissante lors de manifestations et contre-manifestations pacifiques. Le mécanisme d'usage de la force se systématise sous couvert de l'objectif légitime de rétablissement de l'ordre public, entraînant à chaque fois une escalade de la violence. Plusieurs exemples peuvent être ainsi cités, notamment en France, avec des dérives régulières lors de manifestations pacifiques qui ont été constatées et dénoncées au sein même de notre Assemblée. Pour exemple, le recours à des moyens donnés par l'état d'urgence suite aux attentats terroristes de 2015 à Paris pour des manifestations pendant la COP 21. La coercition policière forte pendant le mouvement des Gilets jaunes. Ces dérives manifestes ne sont pas propres à la France et ont également été dénoncées pour d'autres pays. Je pense ici aux récentes fortes répressions suite aux manifestations pacifiques contre la gestion de la crise sanitaire, où nous avons pu voir des citoyens, des personnels de soins, des pompiers entraînés dans une escalade de violence. Plusieurs points accentuent ces dérives. La militarisation des forces de police, le manque de formation et d'effectifs qui les rend sous tension. Il est à constater également une politisation croissante de leurs interventions dans le cadre des manifestations, dérive de leur rôle premier de protection de la population. Le rôle de notre Assemblée du Conseil de l'Europe est de s'assurer du déploiement de la force contre la population qu'en cas de stricte nécessité et seulement dans l'objectif légitime de préserver l'ordre public. Toute dérive de l'usage de la force de manière disproportionnée ou n'intervenant pas dans l'objectif légitime de préservation de l'ordre public est excessif et va à l'encontre des droits fondamentaux des citoyens. L'article 2 introduit le principe d'une proportionnalité stricte de l'usage de la force en ce qu'elle doit être, je cite, absolument nécessaire pour être déployée. L'article 3 vient lui interdire de manière absolue les traitements inhumains ou dégradants. Il est donc urgent de revoir les schémas de maintien de l'ordre et de lutter contre le recours excessif à la force pour la santé de notre population et de notre démocratie. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Madam Warner. And then we go to Turkey and Zia Altunialdis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear colleagues, I would like to congratulate the rapporteur for his excellent work on the systematic problem of excessive use of force. I regret that excessive and unlawful use of violence by police officers against peaceful protesters, different groups including migrants and refugees, and from different race, color, ethnic and religious groups occur everywhere in the world. Even in our continent, we witness that law enforcement officers perpetrate unjust and disappropriate violent acts against citizens, despite the fact that European Convention system provides robust safeguards for preventing use of excessive force. We need to dig deeper and explore the underlying factors that contributed to the violent and unjust acts of law enforcement officers. As rightly highlighted by the rapporteur, in some occasions, racism and xenophobia are underlying factors behind the police misbehavior and discriminatory attitudes. Death of George Floyd was just one example, and it is not exceptional. Unfortunately, some member states use increasing migrant pressure as a pretext for the excessive use of force by the security forces against migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. In similar vein, we witness that in some member states, people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds have been exposed to violence by security forces more frequently. In order to address this systematic problem, we must ensure that national legislation and practice fully comply with international norms. Monitoring is another key dimension to put an end to impunity of officers. In Turkey, police officers are regularly trained with a view to raise awareness about human rights, and those who perpetrate unjust violent acts are accountable for their actions and subject to administrative and judicial proceedings. Having said that, what Ms. Uca said about Turkish police practice is unacceptable and doesn't reflect the behavior of Turkish police practice. And finally, we should not overlook the underlying factors like racism and xenophobia that paved the way for excessive use of force and impunity officers. And I thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Altunialdis. We continue with representative from the Socialist Group, North Macedonia, and Mrs. Arta Sendeli Biali. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Excessive and unjustified use of force must be prohibited. It must not only be prohibited in written acts and legal acts, but also must be prohibited in practice. And in my opinion, it's the practice, the place that derives or gives us very much problems in this direction. Only necessary and proportional use of force must be foreseen by legal acts, and the law enforcement officers as well as police officers must know their very strict competencies in order to don't misuse the possibility for using force towards citizens. This is so because, firstly, because the principle of humanity must be respected and act toward all human beings. The second is that usually police officers use force during the investigation or before investigations, in which the possibility or the probability of a person to be found unguilty is very high. And there is the principle of presumption of innocence that must protect every human being. This report, at the other side, emphasizes or highlights very important principles in which must lay down the use of force, like legality, proportionality, necessity, precaution, and non-discrimination. Furthermore, the report makes the difference between using use of force in order to extort a confession from a suspected person and use of force during the process of arresting of a person. And that is true. Those are two different situations that generates different problems in the practice. But we must not forget that even police officers and law enforcement officers sometimes face very hard situations in the practice. And they must calculate how much force they can use, and if they can use at all force in a very specific situation, for example. And they are not calculators. We cannot request from them to calculate in a very, very strict way. And in this case, I think that the provisions about self-defense that protects human beings or allows human beings to protect themselves for the random citizens must deal or must act also toward the police officers. And at the end, bearing in mind that this report highlights also this kind of situation and measures the necessity for self-defense for protecting the police officers, I think that this report must be supported. And I fully agree with the beginning of this report that Black life matters, but also white life matters, every life matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bilale. Then we continue to give the floor to Mrs. Margaret de Boer from Netherlands, representing the Socialist Group.
Yeah, thank you.
The floor is yours.
Madam Chair. I would like to congratulate the rapporteur with his work on this crucial topic. Although the cause is tragic, I think it is important that Black Lives Matter movement sparked renewed attention to the unjustified use of force, as well as its systemic discriminatory causes. In this regard, I would like to draw attention to several developments in my home country, the Netherlands. Research by, among others, Amnesty International showed that police forces in the Netherlands use criteria related to ethnicity or background in proactive police controls, ethnic profiling. These practices are very harmful as they perpetuate stigmatization of ethnic minorities and can be a slippery slope to disproportionate police violence. In light of this topic and other discoveries of structural discrimination by government organs, for example in the Dutch tax offices, the Dutch Senate has established a parliamentary research committee on effectivity of anti-discrimination legislation. And this committee is comprehensively assessing what problems in legislation, policy, implementation, and experience lead to discrimination, among others within the police. And I want to suggest my colleagues of the Assembly to take similar initiatives in their own national parliaments. When it comes to the topic of excessive and unjustified use of force by the police, I would like to address the need of transparency and independent investigation, as mentioned in the report. In the Netherlands, we have had various cases where the police used violence against protesters. In some cases, the use of violence might have been justified response. For example, when protests against COVID measures were taken over by hooligans who started riots and plundered shops. On other occasions, the violence was, at least at first sight, excessive. Either way, it is of the utmost importance that it is clear, transparent, what type of force was used by the police and who took the decisions to use it. Additionally, proper and independent investigations are necessary to ascertain whether the force was needed, lawful, and proportional. And to conclude, I'm grateful to the rapporteur for addressing this topic and fully support the measures suggested. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. De Boer. We continue to Azerbaijan and Mr. Kamal Yafarov from the European Conservatives. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam President. It's very disappointing that even in the very established democracies, law enforcement officers have used excessive force in many cases, violating the principles of necessity, proportionality, precaution, and non-discrimination, notably in the policing peaceful demonstrations and counter-demonstrations, in handling irregular migration flows. The Black Lives Matter movement proved that the excessive use of force by police is not a number of isolated incidents, but a part of pattern in Europe. Rapporteur refers to France that it also faced criticism for excessive use of the police force. Police used the disproportionate force during the 2016 demonstrations, known as the New Debout. Media and the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights reported numerous cases of police violence in the context of the Gilets jaunes movement in 2018. In 2020, the press continued to report incidents of police violence, such as the death of Cédric Chauvat after his arrest by police in Paris. The following example will point to a different pattern of systemic police misbehavior in Europe. In these stations, law enforcement officers exceeded their powers while confining crowds of people who were not protesting. As many commentators observed, these incidents were different because of the discrimination underlying the police conduct. They also include the failure to prevent counter-demonstrations for turning violent, especially protests motivated by racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, nationalism, or homophobia. In every cycle of migrant crisis in Europe, police violence during the crowd control measures become apparent. During the 2015 refugee crisis, while attempting to stop the influx of the migrants, law enforcement in some member states of the Council of Europe pushed back the migrant crowd using special tools indiscriminately. For example, in 2015, many Syrian refugees were sent back by police using the tear gas and water cannons against the women and children. Again, in 2017, migrants living in the Great Jungle of the Calais claimed to have suffered police violence. Greece has reportedly operated secret extrajudicial migrant detention facilities to prevent recurrence of the 2015 migrant crisis. These facts compel us to think and to consider, to consolidate our joint efforts, to provide effective and updated legal infrastructure for prevention and excessive use of force. Therefore, this report rightfully calls the member states of the Council of Europe to review compatibility of their domestic legislation and practices with the relevant international legal principles governing the use of by the law enforcement officers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yafarov. And the next speaker, I do not see Mr. Kern in the... No, it's not here. And then I continue to the next speaker. It's from Cyprus. It's Mr. Konstantinos Efstatiou. The floor is yours, sir, representing the ALDE group.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I strongly support the well-elaborated report of Mr. Merezko, which highlights a number of very important issues on the use of excessive and unjustified force by law enforcement agents. These issues are both current and enduring and pertain both to the relevant national legal frameworks as well as to the pertinent international legal standards. Let me start my intervention by stressing that a democratic society requires the enforcement of the law. This is the essence of the principle of the rule of law. The law must always prevail and be implemented. Yet, its implementation requires minimum standards and the respect for the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality. Excessive and unjustified use of force by law enforcement officers sustains a general disregard for these basic principles, which is unacceptable in a democratic society. I'll give you an example. In my country, we now discuss for over a year that interrogations must be video recorded. This is wrongly intercepted by the police as an offensive against them. So where there is an authority, there is always the temptation for its abuse. The more the power, the more its protection and abuse. Impunity for human rights violations stemming from police misconduct, brutality, discrimination, and excessive use of force cannot be tolerated. In this respect, there must be regulation and control through accountability and proportionality. Without rightful accountability and proportional liability for such abuse of authority, this behavior is perpetuated and further cases of such conduct sanctioned. I would therefore be extremely beneficial if all pertinent national legislation on international legal norms were collected and codified in an international treaty and made both readily accessible and easily understood in order to facilitate prosecution and conviction in national courts of all the cases emanating from excessive and unjustified use of force. In addition, it should be strongly expressed that non-compliance with the law is intolerable and such conduct punishable regardless its perpetrator. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Efstatio. Then we move and try to have contact in Canada and Mr. Stéphane Bergerot. The floor is yours.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Bonjour, chers collègues. Je remercie le rapporteur, M. Merezko, pour son rapport portant sur les façons de combattre et prévenir l'usage excessif et injustifié de la force par les forces de l'ordre. Il s'agit d'un sujet qui a tout particulièrement retenu mon attention alors que je siégeais à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec, notamment lorsque j'occupais les fonctions de ministre de la Sécurité publique du Québec entre 2012 et 2014. Au début des années 2010, nous avons été confrontés au Québec à une importante crise sociale ayant donné lieu à des épisodes de violence ainsi qu'à un certain nombre de décès et blessures survenus à la suite d'interventions policières. Ces événements ont soulevé de nombreux questionnements dans la population par rapport aux enquêtes touchant les forces de l'ordre soupçonnées d'avoir fait un usage excessif et injustifié de la force. Face à ces situations, j'ai notamment posé 2 gestes importants. J'ai d'abord introduit un projet de loi visant à instituer un bureau des enquêtes indépendantes qui fut sanctionné 1 an plus tard. Avant l'adoption de cette loi, c'est un corps de police différent qui enquêtait sur les incidents impliquant des collègues policiers. Comme je l'ai déclaré à l'époque, cela pouvait donner, dans l'esprit de plusieurs, l'impression qu'une enquête de la police sur la police peut se révéler complaisante, tant dans sa conduite que dans ses conclusions. Pour garantir l'indépendance et l'impartialité des enquêtes menées à la suite de tels incidents, le Bureau des enquêtes indépendantes, entièrement composé d'enquêteurs civils et dirigé par un civil, a vu le jour en 2016. Les policiers représentent l'État et disposent du monopole de l'usage de la force létale au Québec et au Canada. Ils doivent donc adopter une approche d'intervention responsable, s'articulant autour du respect des droits de la personne et orientée vers la prévention et la résolution des conflits. C'est dans cet esprit que, dans la foulée de ce qu'il est convenu d'appeler le printemps érable, soit ce mouvement social initié par des organisations étudiantes qui s'opposaient à la hausse des frais de scolarité, mouvement ayant donné lieu, comme je l'évoquais plus tôt, à quelques débordements violents entre des casseurs et les forces de l'ordre, j'ai institué une commission d'examen sur ces événements, présidée par l'un de mes prédécesseurs au poste de ministre de la Sécurité publique, M. Serge Ménard. Cette commission a accouché d'un rapport contenant des recommandations fort intéressantes quant au protocole sur l'emploi de la force par les policiers. Vous vous souviendrez sans doute qu'en janvier et février dernier, des camionneurs et autres protestataires ont occupé le centre-ville de la capitale canadienne, Ottawa. Après 3 semaines d'occupation, les forces de l'ordre ont démantelé les barricades et campements. L'opération s'est déroulée dans le calme, d'une façon extrêmement méthodique, et ce, sans qu'il soit nécessaire de faire usage outre mesure de la force. Dans le cadre du débat parlementaire portant sur l'entrée en vigueur de la loi sur les mesures d'urgence visant à mettre un terme à cette crise, j'ai déclaré, et je cite, « J'aime à penser que la façon exemplaire dont les policiers se sont comportés à Ottawa pour mettre fin à cette occupation illégale des rues du centre-ville s'est grandement inspiré des conclusions de la commission Ménard quant à l'emploi de la force dans des situations de manifestation et de troubles à l'ordre public. La brutalité policière, on le voit, n'est pas un phénomène inéluctable. Il importe toutefois de poser les gestes appropriés pour la combattre et la prévenir. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bergeron. We heard you loud and clear from Canada. The next speaker is from United Kingdom, Lord Leslie Griffiths, and representing the Socialist Group. The floor is yours.
Chair and colleagues, it's a privilege to take part in this debate, and I'd commend Mr. Meshenskort for his report, but perhaps also the chair of his committee for so ably holding the fort in the circumstances. And perhaps I could also commend those who put this report together for their methodology, the readiness to use description and narrative as part of the case being made, making sure that we understand that it's illustrative rather than exhaustive, gives us a good entree to the nature of a whole range of ways in which the question we're looking at is pertinent for all of us. So I want to say that at the heart of this, the readiness to share those experiences, which in some cases would be thought to be weakening the argument because it's anecdotal, actually strengthens the argument because it's supported so well with the constructive use of facts and statistics. I hope that the meeting will not worry too much about the fact that I bring the United Kingdom into, perhaps encouraged by the methodology that we've enjoyed, because this has been a very, very anxious week for the British delegation. Tomorrow is the end of a parliamentary session in Britain, and all legislation that isn't completed by tomorrow has to be thrown away or started again or whatever when the new session starts. And our government at the moment has been pushing 4 contentious bills through Parliament and whipping their people to come and vote for them against all arguments that are put to the contrary. A number of our own delegation have been going back to England in order to vote this very day. And Conservative peers, members of the House of Lords, have not been allowed to come in order to be there to vote. And I mention all of that simply because one of the proposals in one of the bills is the suggestion that for the first time in our social history, the police will be given authority to prevent demonstrations from happening. This has never happened before. People have the rights, freedom of assembly. It's in certain circumstances, it's not universal, but the idea that a judgment can be made that prevents people from protesting is foreign to us. And I would want to add that illustratively to the material that has come to us in this report. So thank you for the report. I just hope it concretizes into action across the state and that we'll be all the better for it. These are very difficult times.
Thank you so much, Lord Griffiths. And then the last speaker from Mexico is Mrs. Minerva Hernandez Ramos. The floor is yours.
Gracias, Presidenta. Hay un consenso internacional para prohibir en forma absoluta el innecesario y excesivo uso de la fuerza por parte de la policía. Al igual que sucede en Europa y tal como ha sido puntualizado por la Corte Europea de Derechos Humanos, los principios que rigen al uso de la fuerza han sido recogidos en la legislación mexicana. Absoluta legalidad, prevención, proporcionalidad, y rendición de cuentas. Los datos estadísticos de 2021 muestran que en México el 23% de las personas privadas de su libertad fueron detenidas en la calle sin orden judicial de detención. El 86% mencionó haber sufrido algún tipo del uso de la fuerza durante su detención, mientras que el 61% manifestó que se aplicó fuerza física para someterlos. El panorama se complica al considerar que 64% señaló que sufrieron algún acto de violencia después de su detención y hasta antes de rendir su declaración, siendo los tres más comunes mantenerlos incomunicados, amenazas de levantarles cargos falsos y amenazas de hacerles daño. Casi la mitad mencionó haber sufrido algún tipo de agresiones físicas, siendo las más comunes patadas, puñetazos, asfixia o ahorcamiento. Este tipo de abusos policiales se ejemplifica en casos lamentables como los de Giovanni López, detenido por no usar cubrebocas, sometido y golpeado por 10 policías y fallecido por traumatismo cráneoencefálico. Victoria Salazar, refugiada salvadoreña, retenida por supuesto estado de ebriedad, sometida con violencia y fallecida por fractura de la columna vertebral, o las imágenes que dieron vuelta al mundo en que agentes federales mexicanos patearon la cara de un migrante centroamericano después de lanzarlo al piso. Como señala el reporte de la Comisión de Asuntos Jurídicos y Derechos Humanos, el uso excesivo de la fuerza por parte de la policía no son incidentes aislados, sino muestra de un patrón de mal comportamiento sistémico de los agentes del orden. Así, con la finalidad de terminar con la impunidad de estas acciones y reducir los sucesos asociados a estas perniciosas conductas, como parte de la delegación mexicana, recibimos con beneplácito la recomendación que se presenta ante esta asamblea, especialmente en 3 aspectos: la protección efectiva a los denunciantes, proveer de entrenamientos especiales a los agentes policiales sobre el uso de la fuerza e incrementar la transparencia y publicidad de las decisiones de las agencias encargadas del cumplimiento de la ley respecto al uso de la fuerza por parte de sus elementos. Muchas gracias. Ha sido un privilegio participar en esta sesión.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Hernandez Ramos. And it's, I see it's 8:15, and I announced that I will stop and interrupt the list of speakers at 8:15, so I do so. And the speeches of members on the speakers list who have been present during the debate but have not been able to speak may be given to the table office for publication in the office report. And I remind colleagues that typewritten text can be submitted electronically if possible, no later than 4 hours after the list of speaker is interrupted. And I will now, since I do not think that the rapporteur will participate, as far as I am informed, I will give the floor for 3 minutes to the chair of the committee, Mr. Damien Cottier. The floor is yours.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Au fond, c'est assez représentatif, malheureusement, de la manière dont ce rapport s'est finalisé ces dernières semaines, puisque lors de la séance de la Commission, Monsieur Mereshko, qui était en ligne depuis Kiev, la ligne a été interrompue. Il était littéralement sous les bombardements. Et c'est notre ancien président de la commission, Boris Tchilevitch, qui a dû présenter son rapport dans la séance de commission. Et puis aujourd'hui, on l'a vu, il était difficile d'avoir une connexion avec le rapporteur et j'ai rempli ce rôle. Heureusement, il a pu s'exprimer brièvement. J'espère qu'il a pu entendre une partie de ce débat parce que j'aimerais remercier tous les intervenants puisque tous ont souligné la qualité du rapport et ont appuyé les propositions qui sont faites. Le fait qu'il n'y ait pas non plus d'amendement et qu'il y ait eu un très très fort soutien de notre commission prouve, je crois, d'abord la confiance dans ce collègue et puis la qualité du travail qui a été fourni et nous transmettrons les remerciements et les félicitations des différentes personnes qui se sont exprimées à M. Mereshko parce que je crois qu'elles sont parfaitement méritées. Dans l'audition qui avait été organisée, d'ailleurs, il était intéressant de noter qu'il y avait d'une part des activistes des droits de l'homme qui étaient représentés, mais aussi des représentants des forces de l'ordre. En l'occurrence, c'était des représentants de la police du Royaume-Uni qui étaient venus expliquer aussi les méthodes qu'ils ont adoptées dans des cas extrêmement concrets basés sur des expériences de terrain. Donc on voit le travail de terrain qui a été fait, et ça a été relevé à juste titre avec énormément d'exemples très concrets qui doivent permettre d'avancer dans cet important débat. Je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, la plupart des agents des forces de l'ordre dans la plupart des pays font leur travail extrêmement bien. C'est un travail difficile, ils méritent le soutien, ils le font sans exagérer. Mais comme l'État a ce qu'on appelle le monopole de la violence légitime et légale, une de nos collègues a dit avec beaucoup de pouvoir vient beaucoup de responsabilités, c'est absolument vrai, eh bien il est très important que cette violence légitime soit encadrée, qu'elle soit encadrée légalement, qu'elle soit utilisée de manière transparente et donc qu'elle puisse être monitorée, et aussi qu'il y ait un cadre éthique extrêmement clair. Et je crois que le rapport de notre collègue fait des propositions extrêmement précises, extrêmement concrètes dans ce domaine-là qui devront permettre de faire avancer les choses. Et nous l'en remercions, nous remercions l'Assemblée pour l'accueil qui a été réservé à ce rapport et je l'espère à cette résolution et recommandation.
Thank you, Chair. And since the contact with Ukraine is come and go, and we might have contact with the rapporteur, Marzescu, then I think I give you the floor, if possible, for you, for some very short remarks, not
yes,
more.
It will.
2 minutes.
Madam Chair, it will be really short. It will be really short because I just wanted to thank my colleagues. I would like to thank my colleague Suna for her help. I would like to thank excellent, very highly professional colleagues from the Secretariat for their great job. And I would like also to thank all the colleagues who have taken part in the discussion. And I would like to thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Marescu, and it was good to see and hear you and that we had contact. So then the debate is closed. The Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights has presented a draft resolution, document 15498, to which no amendments have been tabled, and a draft recommendation in document 15498, to which no amendments have been tabled. We will start with consideration of the draft resolution, and then we will consider the draft recommendation. We will now proceed to vote on the draft resolution contained in document 15498. A simple majority is required. The vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now open. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Thank you. The draft resolution in document 15498 is adopted. We will now proceed to vote on the draft recommendation contained in document 15498. Members present in the chamber should use the hemicycle voting system. Members participating remotely should vote using the remote voting system. And the vote in the hemicycle and via remote voting is now opened. The vote is closed. I call for the result to be displayed. Thank you, and the draft recommendation in document 15498 is adopted. Thanks to all of you, and the Assembly will hold its next public sitting tomorrow at 10 a.m. with the agenda which was approved on Monday, and the sitting is adjourned. Thank you all, and have a good evening.